Have you ever wondered if the earth once felt the footsteps of beings who were not like ordinary men? The thought drifts quietly, like a feather on still water. It is not the kind of question that shouts for attention, but one that lingers softly in the corners of the mind, refusing to fade. Imagine, just for a moment, the world before memory, before the written word, when shadows stretched long across the valleys, and the silence of the night was broken only by the wind brushing through tall grass. In those forgotten days, perhaps there were shapes moving against the horizon, taller than the tallest man, stronger than the mightiest warrior. Even now, traces of such beings hide in the world around us. Legends of giants passed down in hushed tones by old storytellers. The silent stones of ancient ruins, fitted so perfectly that no blade can slip between them, yet carved by hands we no longer know. Monoliths that rise from the ground as if they had grown there, unmoving witnesses to the ages. Science offers explanations, history suggests others, but the feeling remains, an ache in the human heart to understand who walked here before us. Let the night be your companion as we begin. Listen to the steady breath of the wind against your window, the faint murmur of the world outside. Somewhere far from the noise of the day, the stars are glimmering over darkened hills, watching as they always have. Long before you, long before me, long before the world as we know it, those same stars looked down upon a time when the boundary between the heavens and the earth was not as distant as it seems now. This is not a hurried tale. We will move slowly, as one would stroll through a quiet garden in the moonlight, pausing to notice the smallest shapes and the softest colors. Every sound, every shadow, every glint of light carries part of the truth. We will follow these threads patiently, letting the story unfold like a river, finding its way to the sea. The Nephilim. Their name is like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples across time. There are many stories of them, whispered in deserts, sung by firesides, etched into scrolls, preserved in the oldest of books. Some call them giants. Some believe they were mighty warriors. Others say they were something far stranger, children of two worlds, born of an ancient union between the sons of God and the daughters of men. These are not just words from a faded manuscript. They are echoes, reaching across centuries, waiting for someone to listen. Perhaps you've heard their names in passing, in late-night conversations, or in the soft hum of a documentary playing while you drifted toward sleep. Perhaps you have stood before a towering stone and felt the quiet certainty that the hands which raised it were not like yours. There is something in these mysteries that calls to us, not with fear, but with an almost dreamlike pull, like a door half open, showing just enough to make you step closer. Tonight, we open that door gently. We will not rush into the room. Instead, we will let our eyes adjust to the light, let our ears grow accustomed to the silence. We will sit within the story, not outside it, feeling its warmth, its sorrow, and its wonder. From the first moment these beings set foot on the earth, to the time when waters rose and their voices were carried away, the path is long and winding, but each step is worth taking. And as we walk it together, there is no need for haste. Let your mind settle like snow on a quiet hillside. Let each word be another soft footstep, another turn in the path. This is your time, here and now, to be still and listen. For in the quiet, the past speaks more clearly, and somewhere in that past, the Nephilim are waiting. Before we go further, I would like to invite you to be part of this journey. If you have not yet subscribed to this channel, consider doing so that you will always find your way back to these quiet evenings of stories and scripture. In the comments, tell me your name, your city, and the time at which you are listening right now. I would love to know where in the world you are as we share this moment together. And for those whose curiosity will carry them even deeper, I have placed in the description a link where you can find the complete Bible, 88 books, and the Book of Enoch in English. They will serve as faithful companions for anyone who wishes to keep exploring these ancient paths at their own pace, beneath their own sky. Now, let us take the first step and let the story begin. At that time, the earth was new and still wore the dawn light that had created it. Under a smoke-free sky, vast woodlands hummed softly, their leaves quivering to the gentle beat of the wind. As though they had always known their path, rivers meandered across valleys in a clear, leisurely manner. The dust and haze of centuries had not yet weakened the brightness and steadiness of the innumerable stars above. Like vigilant eyes bending in to observe what the earth was turning into, they appeared to become closer every night. Days passed slowly, unhurried by the sense of desperation that would eventually infiltrate human hearts. Time passed slowly, like a branch drooping beneath the weight of ripening fruit. Humanity lived simply during those early times, tethered to the ground like a kid holding onto a mother's hand. With the first breath of light, men emerged into fields covered with dew, their instruments polished by years of usage. With silent competence, women tended to their families' needs as they went among the hearths and gardens. There was a lot of laughter that spread from house to house on the breeze. Youngsters played fearlessly, making light footprints in the ground with their bare feet before the rains came to erase them. There was peace in the voice that the world was still discovering. Back then, too, land gave freely. Fruits ripened in bunches, wheat sagged beneath the weight of its own profusion, and the herds grazed without fear of claw or fang. The scent of growing things filled the air, including new rain from the hills, tilled ground, and wildflowers. Without hesitation, one could cup the water in their hand and drink it. As though the entire universe moved in time with an invisible rhythm, the seasons arrived one after the other, each gentle and predictable. Despite its naivete, humanity was starting to establish itself in this harmony, crafting tools out of stone, constructing homes out of wood, and creating tales beneath the stars. The family would congregate around little fires at night, their faces glimmering in the flames' flicker. Songs of thanksgiving, harvest, and the moon's transition arose into the night. The people experienced the intimacy of something bigger than themselves during those times, a presence woven into the world's very fabric. Even without being informed, they were aware that they were not alone in the vast sky. And there was a feeling that something was watching from high above, even though there was no shadow yet that disturbed their tranquility. It was subtle, like a whisper on the wind. Occasionally, when the evening became really quiet, the seniors would stop speaking in the middle of a sentence and look off into the distance, their eyes focused on nothing that the younger ones could see. Maybe it was an old habit, or maybe it was something else, the awareness of eyes on them. No one was hurt, and no one's voice was heard, but the feeling persisted, like the slight warmth that remains in the air after a hand has gone through it. The people carried on with their lives as usual, but deep down they sensed that they were a part of a story whose first lines had already been written by an invisible hand. The trees themselves appeared to be conscious, their tall branches moving in unison as though they were welcoming an invisible passenger who was passing overhead. The moonlight caught the reflection of stars that appeared to be much too awake for the hour, and the rivers glistened like silver threads spread across the landscape. There were times when the wind was playful and rushed over the grass in short bursts, and other times when it was sluggish and purposeful, as if it were conveying messages from one end of the earth to the other. Back then, the ripening of fruit, the expanding of seeds, and the gradual movement of clouds across the sky were used to gauge life rather than the urgency of the hours. They still didn't know how to break time up into manageable chunks. All that existed were the nights that lulled them to sleep, the mornings that greeted them, and the evenings that hugged them. They believed that the world was stable and unchanging, so they worked, slept, rejoiced, and dreamed. The world was not without mystery, despite its beauty. Some observed from above the lofty hills, out of the reach of the tallest tree. They witnessed every rut dug into the ground, every seed pushed into the ground, and every child raised high on a father's shoulders, even if they were not involved in the everyday tasks. With a patience that was not constrained by earthly years, their eyes observed human activities. From their vantage point, the lives below played out like a slowly rotating scroll, with a new line being written every day and a new page being turned every night. Neither the identity nor the nature of their watchers were suspected by the populace. For them, the odd silence that occasionally prevailed was just the nature of things, a silence that came and went without reason. In actuality, however, that silence was a gaze, a cautious, unwavering attention that did not pass judgment or meddle. It seemed as though the earliest humans on the planet were being watched and compared to an unobservable pattern. There was emotion in the presence above. The fortitude of their new lifestyles, as well as the manner they tended their land and took care of their relatives, were admired. However, there was also interest in their decisions, aspirations, and innermost thoughts. Even purity can bear the seeds of change, but humanity was still clean and untarnished by widespread corruption. The observers were aware that those seeds would eventually sprout. Nevertheless, the days passed peacefully and without interruption, like the rivers. Without being alarmed or pursued, wild deer browsed next to the shepherd's flock in the meadows. Each season, the vines in the gardens grew taller, their leaves broad and verdant in the sunlight. The children were trained by the elders to read the patterns in the sky and to use the wind's scent to predict when rain would fall. Life was a whole, uninterrupted circle that rotated with the subdued certainty of the seasons. Mothers rocked their children to sleep with melodies older than the language of words beneath the same stars that had always shined. With the chilly night air against their skin, fathers stood in their doorways, looking out over the fields they had planted. And high above, invisible yet ever present, the watchers continued their silent vigil, anticipating the moment when the story would start to change and the balance of this unexplored planet would change. They arrived at the darkest hours of the night, when the stars were blazing across the infinite sky like strewn fire. As if the entire planet had stopped to listen, the air halted its breath. Shapes started to move about the constellations from above. At first, they were so slight that they appeared to be a trick of the sight. Subsequently, they gradually became more distinct, tall, uncompromising shadows that moved through the atmosphere as if the void between heaven and earth were nothing. Hey did not move quickly. As though they were going down into the strata of time itself, it was methodical, patient, and almost surreal. Their shapes caught the moonlight in odd ways, appearing shadowy as if they were woven from the night itself, or dazzling as if they were polished metal. There was no sound of wings beating, no weight on the air, and no sound of footsteps on the wind. Nevertheless, the globe appeared to sense their approach. The ripples of the rivers stopped and they slowed. The woodland branches tilted slightly in the direction of the invisible trail above. As though bowing in silent awe, even the hearth fires burned lower. Despite having a masculine shape, these were not guys. Their silence was too profound, their presence too great. They were God's sons, the watchers who had watched over the planet from a great distance for countless millennia. Now, for unknown reasons, they crossed the invisible realm-to-realm line. Each one moved with an ease that came from being created in the courts of eternity, a grace that was formed out of origin rather than training. Humanity slept in its innocence under them. Families snuggled close to one another in the gentle darkness of their houses, not realizing that their tale was changing right then. The sun rising and setting, crops being sown, and harvests being gathered formed the simple lives of the people. Their pleasures were modest but genuine. The warmth of a hand clutched in the night, the smell of bread baking over an open flame, and the laughter of kids running after one another through fields. This simplicity was both alien and alluring to the watchers. The seasons did not change, the soil did not produce grain through toil and sweat, and they came from a place where nothing changed. In their world, light was endless but devoid of the shadow that gives it value, and beauty was flawless but undeserved. They witnessed the brittle form of beauty that blossoms here on earth only because it is ephemeral. They witnessed love that grew strong, care because life was short, joy that came from conquering adversity, and strength gained via suffering. The watchers experienced a new sensation as they descended. A soft tug, a stirring that was not inherent to their timeless essence. They were now drawn by a subtle, odd need rather than command or duty. For so long they had gazed upon the world, yet from a distance, it had only existed as a picture, a tale seen through a glass window. They realized that distance had kept more from them than they had realized when they finally stepped into its air, heard the subtle rustle of leaves, and smelled the aroma of ripening fruit. There was no tremor or flash of light to signal their arrival when their feet finally hit the ground. Their eyes reflected the starlight as they stood tall among the trees against the moon's faint radiance. As though eager to touch them again, the grass surged back after bending beneath their footsteps. Perhaps understanding that these were not hunters, the nocturnal creatures, the owl, the fox, and the small, timid hare, did not run away. There was silence in the beginning. The watchers' lights flickered and were dim as they looked toward the distant villages. As though they were nothing more than mist, they could see through the clay and wood walls. They observed the farmers dozing off, their hands sore from labor. The women were there, cuddled up protectively with their kids. They witnessed life's gentle breathing unaffected by fear of what may be on the other side of the horizon. In that instant, a thread, invisible and powerful, passed between the realms instead of a word or command. In their own existence, the watchers sensed the warmth of human life, and humanity sensed a change in the atmosphere as if a tide had subtly shifted in the night, but it was unable to identify it yet. This intimacy has its beauty. The watchers had seen heaven, see perfection, but now they were confronted with the flaw that made beauty hurt. They witnessed voices that could shatter but yet speak words of love, hands that could blister but also provide solace, eyes that could get weary but still gleam with joy. They felt as if the land itself was whispering to them, asking them to join in addition to just watching. They stopped by a brook and one of them knelt down to trace his fingers through the water. He was astonished by the cold, live, acute, and brief. When he glanced at his reflection, he saw something changed by the light from the earth instead of the same visage he had always recognized. Someone else grabbed a fruit-laden branch and twisted it in his hand like a gem. When he bit into it, a contrast unheard of in his own world was detected. Sweetness with a hint of acidity. Even though these feelings were minor, they had a profound effect on the watchers, causing them to consider ideas they had never considered before. The road back to their house was still open, and the sky above was still open. But now none of them raised their eyes. Instead, the light from the towns, the sound of a faint song on the breeze, and the fragile delicacy of this planet that had endured without their touch captured their attention. Something unsaid started to develop here, in the silence between their descent and their first move toward human life. A bond that was more delicate and hazardous than duty or simple curiosity. Because of their proximity, the line separating the divine from the mortal was now blurred, and that boundary would not last forever, even though neither realm was aware of it yet. They spent their days under the open sky, with the sun warming their faces and the breeze cooling them at night. The Earth's ladies walked with a grace that belonged to those who had never experienced the clamor of large cities or the weight of kingdoms. Their beauty came from life itself, as evidenced by the way our hair glinted in the morning light and the way their eyes mirrored the serenity of still waters and the blaze of fire on a wintry night. Their beauty was not adorned in gold or meticulously crafted by hand. The air surrounding them was brightened by their laughter, which rose effortlessly like the songs of tiny birds in the canopy. With trained grace, they gathered water from the rivers and carried baskets of grain on their heads. They appeared to wear the earth's natural hues, soft browns, deep greens, and the pale yellow of matured fields, despite their basic clothing, which was made from fibers that were hand-gathered and spun. Their voices, when they talked, were as different as the terrain, some deep and warm as rain on parched ground, others soft as the rustle of grass. In those days, life moved slowly. In addition to teaching their kids how to shape clay, grind wheat, and tend to the fires that kept the night chill at bay, the women also managed gardens with vines that languidly coiled around the edges of stone walkways. As they toiled, they sang, tunes that came naturally to them like breathing and were not learnt from scrolls or instruments. These songs told tales of rain and stars, of planting and harvest, and of the joy that came from the regular rhythms of the ground. It was at these instances of commonplace beauty that people started to observe them from afar. The watchers who had just arrived on the planet were captivated by the sight of such lives that were both little in scope and immense in emotion. The women's beauty lay not only in their physical attributes, but also in the deliberate and considerate way they navigated the world. Their faces were bright when they gazed at their kids, and they exuded a silent power in the way they handled the day's challenges without complaining. Among the watchers, curiosity spread like a slow fire in the Satsis. Ear-own world they had witnessed beauty, but it was static and unaffected by time. Here, beauty carried the delicate burden of impermanence as it changed from sunrise to dusk and from youth to age. They started to notice the littlest things, the way shadows flickered across their features in the last of the light, the curl of a smile that came from joy rather than courtesy, the hair that slid loose and swirled in the wind. The women themselves had no idea that they were being silently watched. The stars were just far-off fires to them, and the sky was just the sky. Their days were being watched from beyond the veil of sight, but they were unaware of it. However, they might have sensed a shift in the atmosphere, a feeling that the world was looking back, deep within their hearts. Now, the watchers experienced more than just curiosity. They were unable to resist the pull, a need that went beyond the limits they had always maintained. They wanted to stand by the women's side when they witnessed their happiness. They felt a peculiar longing to alleviate their grief as they saw it. They were drawn to the warmth, breathing, ever-evolving life of the ground, as well as beauty, and the life to which beauty was tied. Some of the women had calm profundity in their eyes, as though they had experienced loss and yet choose to keep smiling. Some people moved with dexterous, fast hands, molding or weaving with an almost artistic talent. Some people laughed readily, whereas others laughed infrequently, but with greater brightness. As if the earth would take them away at any time, the watchers found themselves learning such things by heart. The sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, according to the ancient words found in the scrolls that would eventually become Genesis. The simplicity of the words belies the gravity of what was stirring. In this context, fairness was not just a measure of beauty, but also of something more profound, the balance between spirit and form, the silent power that may be just as alluring as a face's curve or an eye's brightness. The watchers loved nothing more than the evenings. As they toiled with their hands, repairing clothes, grinding grain, and plaiting each other's hair, the women would congregate at the village's edge and converse quietly. Their faces were painted in gold by the dying rays of the day, and the air smelled of dirt, chilling from the warmth of the sun. The watchers felt most compelled to move forward at that moment, to bridge the gap between themselves and this world they had only seen. In the darkness, one hovered close to a grove while a woman leaned over to fetch water from the creek. She sang a melody that was ancient than any city, with steady, low notes that rippled across the water's surface. Deep within the watcher's mind, the sound calmed thoughts he was unaware were stirring. Droplets clung to her fingers, capturing the last of the sun before returning to the stream, and he watched. He found such insignificant, ordinary moments more fascinating than the most magnificent, heavenly vistas. Another stood on a hilltop overlooking a field where women labored in couples, binding wheat sheaves with rhythmic hand movements. As they traveled the furrows, the dust stuck to their ankles and their hair gleamed under the sky. It was as if the air itself melted around them when they laughed together. The watcher simply knew that such things stirred him, but he had no idea why. Even though nothing had been said yet, the attraction between the god and the mortal intensified. With their eyes tracking every detail and their hearts holding what they saw like a secret they couldn't divulge, the watchers hovered on the periphery of human existence. Despite their ignorance, the ladies continued their lives as usual, planting, harvesting, singing, and sleeping. Their lives a silent tapestry of moments that would soon be woven into a tale much bigger than they could have ever dreamed. Thus, the days went by. Not because of significant occurrences, but more because of the strengthening of an invisible connection, one based on purity, beauty, and a desire that could not be put aside permanently. Two realms' threads started to be woven together into a single, odd tapestry in the days that followed. What had started out as distant glances became into moments where eyes locked and lingered, where voices carried warmth in their tones as they traveled across the atmosphere. The watchers entered the lives of the women they had long watched in silence, dressed now not in the brightness of the heavens, but in shapes that might sit by the fire and roam the fields. There was only the gradual emergence of something new, like morning light leaking into the outskirts of the night, rather than an abrupt storm or a flash of lightning. At first, the unions occurred in silence, with a watcher holding a woman's hand while she gathered water from the stream. His presence was both odd and unthreatening, like ripples flowing outward from a single stone placed into still water. Their remarks to each other were soft. Others eventually joined, and what started off as sporadic relationships developed into a trend. The sight of outsiders who were both strong and silent, with eyes that appeared to mirror far-off stars, became familiar to the villages. In the open air, marriages were celebrated. The aroma of freshly baked bread and the smoke from roasting meat would permeate the air. Long strands of flowers were braided into garlands and draped over neighboring tree branches and wooden beams. The women, decked out in ribbons and beads, walked with a grace that was both familiar and fresh, their delight heightened by the sight of these creatures who had descended from unthinkable heights. With their bare feet dancing to the rhythm of drums that reverberated into the night, children giggled and danced in the dust. Songs were raised into the air in the firelight glow, some new, created from the blending of voices unlike any heard before, and some old, handed down from the time before the watchers arrived. When the watchers joined the earthly women in singing, their voices had a deeper resonance that seemed to reach the heart as much as the ear. It seemed as if the stars themselves had lowered down to listen. In those early days, there was harmony. As though the earth itself approved of these nuptials, fields gave way in profusion. The watchers brought knowledge, how to forge stronger structures, how to mold metal, and how to use long overlooked herbs and roots to heal. They learned from the women the peaceful patience of caring for life and the rhythms of planting and harvesting. Stories were spoken around the fires at night, about the rivers and mountains as viewed from the ground, about the heavens as viewed from beyond the world. These unions produced children with sparkling eyes and loud cries. Everywhere they went, they attracted attention due to their peculiar beauty, which was a blend of both cultures. Even their parents were taken aback by their rapid learning, early walking, and effortless speech. Though these murmurs were only heard during deep night, others said that the earth itself appeared to bend in little ways to their wishes. However, beneath the peace were currents that most people were unaware of. The Watchers carried the burden of their origin and a silent unrest with them, even if they were dressed in mortal form. Even though they cherished the land, there were times when they stood apart from it, gazing off into space as though recalling something they had left behind. Despite being loved and respected, the women occasionally felt an invisible gap in their husbands' hearts. A depth they were unable to access, a desire they were unable to identify. But life went on. As the settlements grew, so did the volume of their meetings. On certain evenings, festivities would continue into the early hours of the morning. Bowls of fruit, fresh bread, and roasted game were spread out on long wooden tables beneath the starlight. The pleasant scent of honeyed wine and the stench of burning blended with laughter as it spread across the fields. Musicians performed lyres strung with fine gut and flutes fashioned from bone, their melodies alternating with the voices of the people in attendance. These partnerships' children were frequently the focal point of these events, hopping into dancers' laps, running between their legs, and posing questions that were way too mature for their age. Their laughter sounded like water hitting stone, pure and ringing. They were also strong, stronger than others their age, capable of running long distances and carrying heavy loads with a stamina that shocked their elders. However, in those days, few questioned such strength, which was considered a gift. The linking of hands at weddings was symbolized by a shared meal between the two realms, in addition to vows exchanged in front of family and friends. The Earth's inhabitants and the Watchers exchanged platters of food, each contributing something unique. Occasionally, the Watchers would deliver odd fruits that no one had ever seen before. Their skins would shimmer subtly in the firelight, and they had a sharp and sweet flavor. At other occasions, as a gift for the family's future, they would offer metal tools that were strong and smooth and unlike anything created in the villages. In exchange, the women gave their labor in the form of baskets containing their harvest's grain and fruit, ceramics painted with earthy hues, and blankets woven with plant dyes. Giving was more than just a tradition. It was a sign of love and a means of welcoming others. We now include you. As the years went by, the blending of these two worlds grew so normal that very few people could recall the previous era. As children grew into adults, the attributes of heaven and earth were reflected in their faces. Alongside their parents, they hunted in the forests, worked the fields, and constructed new dwellings out of stone and wood. But sometimes, for short, fleeting periods, the air would feel heavier, and the laughing of a feast would pause for no apparent reason. During those times, a silent consciousness would descend upon the assembly. People would look up at the wide black sky with its stars burning like vigilant fires. The Watchers themselves would become more silent, their eyes averted, as though they were listening to a sound that no one else could hear. Then, as fast as it had arrived, the weight would go away and the laughter and music would return, as though nothing had moved. Beauty, happiness, and a life no one had ever dreamed of had been brought about by the union of heaven and earth. However, it held a secret force that would not always flow gently, much like a river swollen by spring rain. But for the moment, as if the balance between them would last forever, the flames were warm, the people danced under the stars, and the sounds of two worlds rose together into the night air. It started out modestly when a child unlike any other was born. Even as a newborn, the mother's arms struggled to support him despite their strength from years of laboring in the fields. His wail echoed quietly against the walls of their home, deep and resonant instead of the shrill, frail sound of other infants. Unbelievably bright, his eyes seemed to take in more than they should, observing, almost scrutinizing his surroundings. His hands closed with unexpected force, but they were soft, as if he knew instinctively that his strength needed to be controlled. The villagers were in awe of him in those early years. He developed more quickly than the other kids, and every month brought about more significant changes. When he was able to walk, he had remarkable balance and confident, steady steps. He was able to hoist grain baskets that required 2 adult men to carry before his 3rd year. All of this strength, however, was accompanied by an odd, disarming innocence. He laughed a lot and didn't try to hurt anything around him. He would silently crouch with his big hands outstretched, waiting for birds to hop into his palms as they landed close by. His compassion, despite his diminutive size, extended to even the tiniest insects. Others like him were born as the seasons changed, kids taller than their classmates, with long, strong limbs and loud voices even as young. It was amazing to watch them sprint across the meadows. They moved so quickly across the land with their strides that dust swirled in their wake. The water rushed high around their bodies as they played in the rivers, the current bending under their weight. They spent hours splashing with each other, chasing fish, while shouting happy cheers that reverberated into the nearby hills, even though they could wade over streams that would carry others away. These young giants used the mountains that had always hovered above the horizon as playgrounds. With goat-like agility, they would clamber up steep hillsides, their fingers finding grips in rocky faces where there was no trail. They would shout into the open sky while standing together on tall rocks, their heads raised to the breeze, their hair flowing behind them. Shepherds in far-off valleys would stop and look up, wondering if a storm was approaching, because their voices could be heard so far away. The populace was both proud and in awe as they observed them. Their movements bore an unearthly quality, even though they were offspring of their own blood and flesh. The chores that previously took days to complete could be completed in hours when they collaborated with the villagers. As if they were only bundles of straw, stones that had been too heavy to move for building walls were lifted. With a few motions of their enormous hands, they could topple trees, and houses arose more quickly than anyone could have predicted. The giants were remarkably gentle for their stature. To collect crops without stomping on the plants underfoot, they would delicately squat in the fields. They went more slowly among the younger kids, being careful not to topple anyone. In order to avoid being too tall, they sat cross-legged on the ground at feasts. Their enormous hands carefully picked at the food to avoid smashing the bowls or spilling the wine. They were making deep, rolling waves of sound that seemed to warm the air around them, and their laughter was as much felt as heard. Despite their disparate sizes, they frequently created games that others could participate in. They could carry the smaller kids on their shoulders so they could see the world from a height no ladder could reach, or they could hoist them high into the air and whirl them about until their cries became happy squeals. The rivers turned into a popular location for parties. The giants would urge others to join them as they waded into the deepest areas on sweltering days when the cool current brushed against their chests. As the giants swam with long, sweeping strokes, children would climb onto their broad backs and cling to their shoulders. In their wake, the water swirled and gleamed in the sunlight. At times, they would resurface with a shower of droplets that caught the light like falling stars after plunging beneath the surface and holding their breath for incredible periods of time. The giants enjoyed lying in the grass at night and watching the stars spread out in all directions. They appeared attracted to the sky, as if gazing at it evoked some long-forgotten recollection. They would use their fingers to trace lines between stars and point out constellations that the locals were unaware of. Occasionally, their deep voices were quiet and almost reverent when they spoke of them using odd names that no one else knew. Unquestionably, they were beautiful, and there was a feeling that something unique and valuable had become ingrained in the populace. The giants' careful attention to detail provided solace to parents of younger children. It was frequently the giants that kept the homes safe during storms and carried the sick and weak to safety. Because of their size, wild creatures would stand at the border of the fields and drive danger back into the woods if they strayed too near the village. When the giants were young, they thought they shared the same world as their parents. They were not yet aware of the distinction that made them unique or the significance of their origin. To them, life was the delight of climbing higher than anyone else, the green of the fields and the glimmer of river water. The laughter of their friends and the affection of their families satisfied them. They sang in a language that blended the tones of heaven and earth, and their voices were frequently the first to greet the dawn. The wind would carry the music across the valleys until it dwindled into the distant hills. For many who heard it, it was a wordless song, yet it evoked a deep, heartfelt sensation that was simultaneously happy and somehow sorrowful. A gigantic child would occasionally be seen sitting by himself in the early morning silence, his great hands encircling his knees as he watched the sun rise. He would just respond that the stars had been brighter the previous evening, or that the sun appeared closer from the mountain's edge when asked what he was thinking. These brief moments were soon overshadowed by the demands of the day's labor, or the want to play, but they made a subtle imprint on those who saw them. Nobody had anticipated how the birth of the Nephilim would alter the rhythm of life. More wonder, laughing, and unity of strength were all present. The country seemed more alive, the people felt safer, and even the night sky seemed somehow richer, as if it reflected the new life it had brought to the ground. Back then, the giants were adored and not feared or envied. Their presence made the world appear larger and its beauty more approachable. Quiet talks under the wide sky were the first. In the chill of the evening, the watchers would sit among the people, their eyes reflecting the fire's brilliance, their presence still a source of wonder. They carried a burden of memory that extended beyond the hills and rivers, and their voices were deep and resonant. At first, their words were soft, like a brook running through virgin ground, yet they held seeds that would alter the whole course of human existence. The ability to shape metal was one of the earliest gifts. Stone had been the people's constant companion up until that point. Huge hammers cut from the mountain bones, sharp flakes blasted from river rock. When the veins were released from stone, they glowed like dull fire, and the watchers demonstrated to them how to extract them from beneath the soil. These odd stones softened and glowed with an inner light amid the heat of well-managed flames. They were shaped by the watchers, hammers that never chipped, swords that cut with the accuracy of the wind's edge, and decorations that shone like snatched sunlight. The valleys started to reverberate with the sound of metal on metal, a fresh pulse in the landscape. The knowledge of the stars followed. On bright evenings, the watchers would guide small groups away from the village fires to locations where silver rivers appeared to flow from the sky. They used their hands to draw patterns in the sky, giving each light a name and narrating their movements. The individuals discovered that the stars followed paths that could be read like a map, rather than being dispersed randomly. The moon's shifting face served as a clock, and the emergence of specific constellations indicated the arrival of new seasons. Farmers started sowing their seeds using the methodical turning of the sky, rather than relying solely on tradition or conjecture. By observing which stars occupied the faint light of the dawn, one could even predict the floods of the rivers. The secrets of the planet were also disclosed. The watchers carefully collected plants from the fields and woodlands, their fingers grazing the foliage as if to say hello to old acquaintances. They learned which flowers had scents that soothed the restless mind, which leaves soothed fever, and which roots could cure wounds. Some plants were cooked to induce sleep, while others had seeds that could be powdered into powders to give tired people power again. As their baskets filled with medicines, colors, and scents they had never previously considered gathering, the people listened and learned. The village changed as the days stretched into weeks. Gardens were no longer just for sustenance. They now had rows of flowers for aesthetic purposes and herbs for medicinal purposes. Frequently, the scent of dried flowers and crushed leaves filled the air. As metalworkers fashioned tools and decorations, fires raged deeper into the night. Farmers started talking about planting for abundance rather than just survival, about transforming the land into a place that was both aesthetically pleasing and nourishing. The watchers interacted with the populace as teachers rather than as alien entities. They led without hurry, allowing knowledge to develop at a rate commensurate with the changing of the seasons. By observing the North Star night after night until its consistency is as recognizable as a fry, N's face, a kid can learn to know it. As the sun rose, a secret might be spoken to a young woman, telling her when to gather a certain plant when its healing power was at its strongest. Learning itself became a part of the rhythm of life. Knowledge proliferated like a flower's gradual bloom. Only a select few were first skilled in working the new metals, but soon others joined them, and the sound of molding bronze and iron spread like sheep bleating. The watchers' memories of the star patterns were transferred into the people's songs, which were then transported to far-off valleys by travelers. With their fingers drawing imaginary lines across the sky, even the youngest infants were able to identify constellations by name. The way people started to view the world was what transformed lives, not just the tools and healing. Rivers and hills were no longer merely routes or borders. They were now a part of a larger map that was linked to the motion of the skies. Not only food or weeds, plants were partners with a purpose, each with a secret that could be carefully unearthed. No longer merely stones, the metals extracted from the earth were jewels that could be sculpted to protect, serve, and embellish. They even started to change how they celebrated. Metal lamps, which shone steadily and brightly and reflected their light on the polished surfaces of bronze plates and cups, replaced firelight as the primary source of illumination at feasts. As their songs continued into the night, musicians discovered new tones in instruments strung with metal wires. Their lives were woven with a harmony of earth and sky, with woven clothing dyed with hues derived from exotic flora and jewelry made of silver and gold gleaming against them. The watchers appeared to enjoy the sharing, quietly observing as the people's lives became more prosperous, their labor more expert, and their get-togethers more lively. As if they had witnessed innumerable universes ascend into wisdom in the past, they saw a light in their eyes that resembled the stars they loved to talk about, a reflection of something ancient. Occasionally, during the darkest hours of the night, a watcher may be seen standing by himself and looking up. Their eyes followed routes that others could not see, as if the stars they had taught the people to read were speaking to them inaudibly. They seemed practically absorbed in their thoughts during those periods, as if recalling a distant location outside of the stars. It went unquestioned by the populace. They were happy to live in this gradual emergence of knowledge, to wake up every day knowing something new, and to observe how the lessons of the past were applied to the tasks of the present. With their hands on the ground and their towering bodies bending in close, the watchers listened to secrets older than the mountains, and even the giant's offspring listened with wide eyes. The fields flourished under the meticulous scheduling of planting and harvesting after previously being at the mercy of the sun and rain. Once cautiously entered, the forests developed into gathering and healing spaces. Once merely a source of water and fish, the rivers now carried boats that were expertly crafted with metal bands reinforcing their hulls. This unprecedented harmony between human hands and divine wisdom seemed to make the planet itself lean closer, offering up its treasures. Thus, the days went by in silent awe. The region was marked by a people who had learned to use knowledge from beyond to not only survive, but also to mold their own future. The touch of the watchers was felt in every skillfully carved blade, every carefully planned planting, and every herb picked at the ideal time. A gift presented beneath the open sky, where the earth appeared to listen, and the stars bore witness. At first, the transformation was so gradual and subtle that it was difficult to pinpoint when it started. Once tall kids who ran after the wind through valleys and played in rivers, the Nephilim started to change the way they carried themselves. Once unadulterated and unbridled, their laughter now had a hint of knowledge. They now viewed the mountains as victories to be claimed rather than as obstacles to overcome. The excitement of the hunt, not for food but for mastery, took the place of the simple delight of sprinting alongside the deer. They traveled across the terrain in ways that reduced the size of the earth. When the sun was low, their shadows stretched across entire fields, and a single step from them could span the distance of several men. The houses and gardens of common communities looked frail in the face of their might, like straw and stick toys. Once bending down to assist with planting or harvesting, they now stood apart, talking among themselves in low enough tones for others to hear, and looking out over the horizon as though they were the only ones in charge of the world. The hunts started off as large parties with lots of skill and laughter, an opportunity to demonstrate one's strength and quickness. However, they changed with time. More animals than the people could utilize were taken by the Nephilim, who occasionally left the remains behind carelessly. It was now about demonstrating who could take down the biggest stag, the most vicious boar, and the fastest gazelle, not about supporting the village or paying respect to the lives lost. Each victory was a declaration of supremacy, and these competitions turned into a test of pride. The woods became more silent. Herds dispersed at the fragrance of the giant's approach, and birds flew at the sound of heavy footfall. Knowing that the hunt would be futile if the Nephilim were around, smaller hunters, men and women who had previously traveled freely, started to avoid particular regions. There was no rivalry between arms that could knock down a monster with a single blow or legs that could outrun a deer. The land and people's relationships started to sway. This change was sensed by more than just the animals. The presence of their tall companions made the people themselves feel smaller. It was first awe-inspiring to be next to such creatures. It was like being next to living monuments. However, when astonishment is overpowered by authority, it transforms into subdued discomfort. The Nephilim stopped participating in the village's everyday tasks. At feasts, they occupied the best seats, their voices rising above the others and their choices turning into orders rather than recommendations. Even the Watchers, who used to lead both giants and humans, started to notice these developments with unreadable, silent faces. Whispers of stories started to circulate. He was humiliated and beaten after being challenged in sports by a giant who had previously carried a wounded man home. Another, infuriated by a thoughtless comment, smashed a clay water jar in his palm and left without saying sorry. These occasions were infrequent at beginning, but they were significant since a Nephilim's strength was unmatched by human strength. As their pride grew, the land itself seemed to react. Trees bowed or broke as they passed, so paths widened where they went. To make open crossings big enough for their stairs, stones were removed from riverbeds. In addition to providing protection from untamed animals, villages started to spring up in the shade of hills so that they would feel less vulnerable to onlookers from such lofty altitudes. Nevertheless, the recollection of the previous harmony would occasionally resurface. A Nephilim might join in a song by the fire, or he might raise a child over his shoulder so they can see above the treetops. However, these occasions became less as frequent as the spectacle of their competitions and their tacit claims to the land took center stage. Some of the populace started to question whether the giants still saw them in the same manner. True camaraderie had formerly existed, characterized by equal regard for one another's position in the world and shared laughing over meals. The Nephilim's gaze now had a strange weight, as though they were staring at something smaller, something that should be commanded or protected rather than walked alongside, rather than at peers. The hunts grew bigger and more lavish. Early in the morning, the sound of drums would reverberate throughout the valleys, summoning everyone to observe. As the Nephilim surged into the trees, their laughter and cries trembling the air, men and women would line the margins of the forests. They would return with their loot, tusks carved from animals no one had ever seen before, pelts that filled an entire house, and man-sized horns. Instead of being traded or used, the prizes were put on display for public admiration. The pride showed most clearly in these displays, with their hands outstretched to reveal the beast's enormity and their voices raised in triumph. The giants would stand before their trophies and narrate the moment of the death. They would search the crowd's faces for the glimmer of awe or the silent nod of recognition that attested to their supremacy. After freely mixing with the populace, some of the Watchers started spending more time with the Nephilim. As if to direct them, or perhaps to remind them of something, they talked to them softly, away from the fires. It was difficult to tell, though, if the giants paid attention. The indications of self-control that had characterized their childhood, waiting for the last morsel of food, moving aside to give others space, were disappearing. The populace then adapted their way of life to accommodate these imposing figures. Hunting teams grew smaller and traveled farther in search of unexplored territory, and paths leading to the forest became less frequented. Since most of the animal pelts had been taken in the giants' competitions, the community's markets started to see fewer of them. Their presence also affected the daily rhythm of work. Fields were planted and harvested sooner to avoid the Nephilim's gatherings interfering with the task. Their stomping footsteps turned into a symbol unto themselves. At the sound of it, kids would stop playing their games and move aside, their eyes wild. With their backs straight, elders would observe the passing shadows in silence. These moments were devoid of malice, but they also lacked equality. Things had changed in scale. And some people recalled the past when the fires were low and the drums were quiet in the evenings. When the giants were young, their happiness was untarnished by pride, their hunts were conducted with laughter, and their presence was consoling. These same fires now created long shadows that extended outside the village's boundary, shadows that appeared to bear the shape of something that was no longer just a friend, but a ruler in name only. As if the land itself had taken a deep, shallow breath and never quite released it, it started out silently, almost imperceptibly. There were now gaps, patches of sky showing through where no sky had previously been visible, where the trees had once stood like silent sentries, their branches creating a tapestry of green high above. In the time it took the sun to rise a little higher in the morning, the Nephilim, with their immense power, could clear a grove. With a sound like the shattering of old bones, trees that had taken ages to grow to their full height were suddenly uprooted, their roots ripped from the ground. The explanation of the reasons was not harsh. Some of the trees were felled to create open areas for meetings and for the giants to roam about freely. Great halls with beams so thick they could support roofs bigger than any home the locals had ever known were among the others that were used for construction. It had the same impact, though. With every clearing, the land became more exposed, the winds became less filtered, and the animals became little less certain of where to seek cover. Rivers that used to meander over the landscape like silver threads started to alter their path. The Nephilim would reroute a flow to irrigate the fields they claimed, or they would move stones to create bridges for their lengthy strides. The delicate equilibrium of the waterways changed as a result. Fish that had been in the same ponds for many generations discovered that they were either silt-clouded or drained. Once fed by constant currents, the plants along the banks now either drowned in unexpected floods or suffered in dry soil. Once a component of the evening's music, the frog and bug songs started to wane. The country was altered by more than just the giants. The people started to take more from the earth than they had previously because they were anxious to master the talents that the Watchers had shared, such as forging metals, molding tools, and tilling more ground. Chunks of iron and bronze emerged from the earth, creating trenches that, after rain, filled with murky water. As fields expanded, the wild's boundaries moved farther back. The concept of enough started to expand. Why not make more if more could be made? Even while there were still songs in the evenings and laughing in the villages, a silent change had taken hold below it all. The smell of flowers and woodland resin had been replaced by the biting tang of hammered metal, which came from smoke from large flames used to form tools or clear land. Sometimes there was a slight haze in the sky above the valleys, which made the sunset a deeper shade of red. Now animals moved differently. The deer had learnt to stay in the deeper woods and no longer hung around at the borders of fields, looking for falling grain. Birds built their nests higher, out of the grasp of enormous and human hands. Once cautiously circling the villages, wolves vanished completely from certain areas, their tracks becoming icy. Though not abrupt, the absence was observed. It was said casually at first, perhaps they have gone to richer hunting grounds, but as the seasons went by, it grew harder to ignore the silences. The rivers spoke for themselves. In the past, a man may go to the bank in the midst of the day, kneel and drink mindlessly by cupping his palms. The taste of earth that had been too thoroughly disturbed, or the subtle metallic tang of tools that had been rinsed clean upstream, were now present in some areas of the river. In order to reduce their reliance on open water, several settlements constructed deeper wells. Although it was a minor alteration, there was a feeling that the land was no longer as unconditional or certain. The Nephilim were not a destructive race. They saw the land's formation as a manifestation of their character and gift. Their power was demonstrated by wide halls and large highways, and their mastery was demonstrated by the rerouting of rivers. However, there was an increasing sense of being carried away by something beyond their control for the people who had previously coexisted peacefully with the cycles of planting, harvesting, and herd migration. The seasons arrived as usual, but their patterns appeared to have changed. Young shoots were washed away before they could take root by rain that came too soon, too late, or too heavily. The air was dry and restless as the summers dragged on. Nobody referred to it as ruin, nevertheless. The songs by the fire contained no accusations. Rather, the old stories were alive, read in a somewhat different way. There was now a tinge of nostalgia for the early gardens, when all the plants flourished in their proper places and required little care. Although the younger ones listened with wide eyes, they had never had that perspective of the world. The rivers had always changed shape, and the woodlands had always been thinner. There were still areas of unspoiled beauty where the water giggled over stones that had not been disturbed by heavy footsteps, and the wind blew through the trees with the same voice it had always known. However, these locations no longer felt like the ordinary surroundings of life, but rather like jewels to be carefully visited. As if putting them away for a time when they might be needed, elders would lead the kids to these locations and instruct them to listen to the noises of the wild. The subtle modifications appeared to be seen by the watchers as well. More frequently than not, some of them explored the land, staring at the barren hillsides, the widening roadways, and the silent ponds devoid of frogs. At least in public, they didn't talk much about it, but their eyes were heavy with knowledge. At times, they stood apart from the others, gazing out to the horizon as if measuring something invisible. Life went on. Harvests were still harvested, feasts were still celebrated, and babies were still born. However, the bond that used to bind all living things together, tree, river, man, and beast, felt weaker, as if the threads were being stretched too far. Once a chorus of innumerable voices, the music of the land now appeared to have gaps, notes missing, and verses lost. And there were some who recalled the past during the peaceful early morning hours when the world was motionless and the mists rose from the rivers. They could remember the deep, stable feel of the ground beneath bare feet and the sound of deer rinking fearlessly at the water's edge. They recalled evenings when the stars appeared to be touching each other, their brightness illuminating a world that was undisturbed and unrushed. However, as the days went by, those recollections started to feel more like dreams, beautiful indeed, but a part of a time that was vanishing faster with every falling tree, shifting river, and quieting wild singing. The world appeared as a living tapestry from above, with its rivers sparkling in the sunlight, its forests absorbing green waves, and its mountains acting as somber timekeepers. At vistas too far away for the sight to follow, the waters met the sky as they swayed in their never-ending rhythm. However, threaded throughout this beauty was a subtle shift, a ripple that started tiny but has since expanded around the world. There was a new tone and weight to the laughing that used to come from the valleys, one that wasn't present in the early days. Like a strained branch, not quite broken but no longer in its original shape. The harmony between the created things was bending. Nothing was veiled from the heavens. Before the one who had molded it all, every concealed deed, silent thought, and covert goal was revealed. He watched the Nephilim traveling over the earth, gigantic in stature, their shadow extending far over the smaller lives around them, and he saw the children of men roaming in fields that were no longer as pure as when they had been granted. He saw the hills stripped of their cover, the rivers redirected from their old beds, and the animals roving farther in pursuit of what had previously been abundant. His eyes, however, went beyond the obvious changes and peered deeper into the silent corners of the heart where the earliest seeds of an idea germinate. The transition was most sad here, in the innermost recesses of the human soul. Many people's thoughts were no longer influenced by the soft rhythm of caring for one another and the land. In addition to food and shelter, there was now a greater need for more, control over others, and most important, netly, self-gratification. A man used to share his bread without thinking twice, but these days he weighs the potential losses and makes calculations. Words that were previously used to heal might now be honed like blades and used to cut. There was beauty, though. There were fathers helping their sons and daughters with planting, moms holding their children under the shade of fig trees, and moments of sheer laughing that made the air itself feel lighter. Alongside them, however, came deeds of stealing without reciprocation, statements that caused pain instead of consolation, and choices taken without considering the consequences for those unable to protect themselves. He beheld everything from his vantage point above, not in pieces, but in its entirety. One person's generosity was juxtaposed with another's brutality, a shepherd's singing juxtaposed with a mistreated man's cries. There was a change in the equilibrium, and it was not in the right direction. According to Genesis, the Lord observed the earth and realized that all human imaginations and ideas were consistently evil. It happened gradually, like the dimming of a lamp when oil gets low, rather than abruptly, like a light going out. The root itself became obscured by 1,000 tiny decisions, each bending away from the light. The Nephilim also had a role to play. Although their strength was amazing, they no longer only used it for protection and construction. For some, pride had become a shroud, and with it came the reckless treatment of those who were weaker. Originally done for sustenance, a hunt may today be done for the rush of control. Once sown for many, a field may now be retained for a select few. From the height of heaven, these changes were gauged by the direction of the heart rather than the magnitude of the deeds. He who created the first breath understood what was in man's heart. Thus his sigh. T was not surprising, but it was sorrowful. I'm sorry that the once perfectly tuned melody of creation now contains dissonant notes. The sun continued to rise, the rivers continued to flow, and the stars continued to move throughout the night. But behind all of these constants was the awareness that the order he had established was being overturned. The remaining angels stood motionless, their eyes fixed on the ground. Others gazed with a sense of sorrow that comes from knowing what such a turning away would entail, while others stared with longing for what had been. There was a sensation of something approaching, a point that all of this was heading toward, even though time in the heavens is not measured like it is on earth. Nothing was out of his reach, not even the highest mountain peaks or the darkest valleys, the sea-breathing beaches or the wind-singing deserts. As vividly as the cries of the unjustly in the shadow of a giant's hall, he heard the laughing of a child in a peaceful village. Every act of brutality, every act of generosity, every decision to honor or to keep for oneself alone, all of these were exposed. Like a shadow cast at midday, the truth of Genesis 6:5 was inscribed over the world during these times. Men's thoughts had turned along with their hearts. Although the roots of humility and peace were still known, they were more difficult to locate, like weed-grown paths. Fewer people decided to attempt, and those who did had to overcome a lot to walk in them. Nevertheless, he did not observe in haste. The one who had formed the mountains could have quickly leveled them, and the one who summoned the waves could have commanded them to return with a single word. However, despite his anguish, his eyes were patient. Instead of trying to find fault, he watched with a desire for the lost to go back. Still, there was no turning back. Every day's decisions helped the participants move closer to the pattern they had established for themselves. In the courts of heaven, the change was evident, yet the sky above the earth were the same color as the eye, blue during the day and rich with stars at night. Though it had changed, the world was still lovely. It was not intended to be that way. Seeing the beauty that remained and the shadow that grew, the one who had once walked with man in the garden now watched from above, his heart aching too deeply to express. There lived a man whose life was ordinary to others, but greatly cherished by the one who watched everything, in a peaceful valley where the hills stood like gentle guardians and a narrow creek meandered through grassy fields. Noah was his name. In the spring, the perfume of wildflowers filled the air in his valley, and in the summer, the wind caused the wheat fields to sway in a leisurely, golden beat. Noah would rise before the dawn and emerge into that dreamy, pale light on certain mornings when the mist was low over the ground and curled in the folds of the country. His days were routine, molded by the silent labor of caring for the land, watching for the animals under his care, and guiding his family with composure. Noah's life proceeded more gently in a world that had become restless. He was not seduced by the boisterous pursuits of those who wanted more than their fair share, nor was he attracted to the arguments that broke out in neighboring cities. He listened to others who gathered to brag about their strength or the size of their harvest, but he did not compare himself to them. His criterion was different, whether he had been truthful in his interactions, if he had shown concern for the stranger who came through, and if he had spoken the truth even at the expense of his own safety. He stood out without ever trying because of his unassuming integrity. The figure appeared to be reflected in the valley. Even in the late summer heat, the stream never dried up. Enough was produced by the earth to support his family and others in need. Every season, the fruit trees on the slope lowered their limbs, providing more than could be consumed. Noah tended it as a caretaker cognizant of the gift rather than as an owner demanding possession, even if it was not a location of wealth in the sense that many others understood it. When the labor was finished in the evenings, he would frequently stroll along the edge of the field and see the light changing into vivid blue and gold hues. Sometimes his kids would follow, asking questions about the flora, the stars, and the bend of the stream. Since he knew that part of his job was to teach them, he responded patiently. Even though the world outside his valley was changing, Noah had refused to let it mold him. In nearby towns, people spoke louder and lost their temper more easily. The Nephilim continued to walk among men, their immense strength and size being both feared and revered. A lot of people tried to win their favor by bending over backwards. Rivers were claimed for one man's use, fields were forcibly stolen, and justice was no longer freely provided but rather exchanged. However, justice was still valued in Noah's household. He wouldn't steal something that wasn't his or keep more than he required. Not that Noah was immune to adversity. Crops occasionally failed. Illness has been to his home previously. He had experienced the grief of burying a friend and the burden of seeing others he loved choose to follow bad paths. He did not, however, turn away from the one who created him in any season, whether it was one of blessing or loss. Like the rest of his life, his prayers were straightforward and devoid of fancy jargon. Thanks in a whisper over bread. When the earth was dry, a prayer for rain was made. A silent admission whenever he sensed the beginnings of annoyance or rage. There was a night when the air was calm and the sky was loaded with stars. After completing his nightly stroll, Noah sat just outside his house's doorway, listening to the distant murmur of the stream. The soft rise and fall of his family's respiration could be heard from inside while they slept. He traced the familiar routes of the stars he had known since childhood. And then, suddenly, the silence grew more profound. It was a quietness that seemed to listen back, not the quiet of a deserted night. A voice emerged from that silence, one that seemed to speak straight to his heart as much as to his ears. It was not like the voices of men or even the wind blowing through the trees. Despite its softness, it had a weight that no earthly sound could match. The valley, the stream, and even the stars appeared to pause as it murmured his name once. Noah. At first, he didn't respond verbally since his breath had caught. In that moment, he realized he was in the presence of the one who had created the mountains, the seas, and the life inside them. So he bowed his head out of reverence rather than fear. Once more, the voice spoke with a depth that caused every word to sink into his soul rather than sound rushed. It informed him that there was a great deal of violence on earth, that human behavior had strayed from morality, and that the equilibrium of creation was all but gone. However, it also mentioned him, not in a way that was supposed to boost pride, but rather in acknowledgement of his loyalty and readiness to follow the path that had been established from the start. With his head still bent and his hands on his knees, Noah listened. Although the voice did not foreshadow the impending sadness, it also did not deprive him of hope. It informed him that he was selected for a project that was unlike from any other he had ever encountered. The task would not be simple. It would require more work than his arms could provide and more faith than his mind could comprehend. But when all else would be swept away, it would save life. When the voice died, the stars overhead became brighter, as though they themselves had witnessed what had been said. Long after, Noah sat there with his thoughts swirling like the stream's languid current. He had no desire to wonder why he had been selected instead of someone else. Only the burden of the calling and the silent assurance that the one who had spoken would not abandon him in it weighed on him. The chamber was dark, illuminated only by the embers on the hearth when he finally got up and entered. Unaware of what had been said outside their door, his wife and kids went to sleep. Sleep came slowly but peacefully as he lay down next to them, his head still reverberating with the sound of that voice. Because Noah knew deep down that the one who created the earth was still keeping watch over it, and that there was a way for the faithful to follow even when it seemed like the world was lost. The smell of damp dirt from a night of light rain permeated the cool morning air. Dew clung to each blade of grass like a scattering of tiny pearls, while mist still hung in the valley's folds. After standing still for a while and taking a deep breath, Noah touched the trunk of a tall cypress. Under his palm, the rough bark revealed deep grooves that told the tale of years past. Recalling the voice that had spoken to him beneath the sky, he closed his eyes for a moment before raising his axe. The initial blow was not hasty, it was purposeful. Wood against steel, a hollow, echoing thump that carried no harshness, reverberated softly through the valley. Birds wheeled into the pale sky after being startled by the branches above, but they quickly went back to rest farther away. The tree's fibers relaxed with each swing, releasing the crisp, clean scent of young sap. There was little sense of urgency, and the work was steady. With a deep, muffled moan, the massive trunk finally gave way after bending and creaking. For a long, Noah stood next to it, his palm resting on the fallen bark as if in gratitude. Day by day, the assembly started. Wood from gopher and cypress, which we reselected for their durability and strength, was smoothed and shaped. The sounds of hammers meeting pegs with rhythmic patience and saws sliding through grain filled the valley. No hasty clatter or haste to fulfill a deadline was there. As usual, Noah worked slowly, finishing each assignment as though it were the only one he had ever had to do. Following his silent guidance, his sons joined him, their movements becoming more confident. While another cut, One would steady a beam, the faint rasp of the saw mingling with the soft sigh of the wind through trees nearby. Few initially showed up to observe what he was doing. Just past the village's border, where the grass became higher and the creek curved in a broad arc, was the clearing where he worked. But, as usual, word got around fast. Some arrived out of curiosity, bending their heads while leaning on their staffs or crossing their arms. What use could such a vessel have so far from the shore of any great water, they muttered to each other. The word ark was said in a variety of hesitant tones, and some of them even gave a small smile in amusement at the sight of so much carefully carved lumber. The bravest guests were children. They would approach more stealthily than the grown-ups, slipping their hands down the smooth edges of the planks or looking between the beams. As Noah's chisel created a flawless groove, a boy, little older than 8, crouched down to observe. He whispered quietly, "It's like a house," but nobody responded. Another child's fingers curled against the warmth the wood had absorbed from the sun as she reached out to touch it. Noah didn't go into further detail. He would just respond, "It must be done," when asked why he was constructing something so enormous. He spoke calmly and without defensiveness, which frequently made the person asking the question hesitant of whether to ask more quests. Most didn't. After a while of merely observing, they drifted back toward their homes, their curiosity temporarily satiated. Weeks later, the shape started to take shape. Each wood rib snaking upward like the spine of some gigantic creature, the skeleton structure loomed against the valley hills as a backdrop. A combination of soil, water, and life, the aroma of the adjacent stream blended with that of fresh wood. The pounding of hammers sounded from a distance, like a steady, slow heartbeat. There were evenings when Noah would stop working and just stand, examining the frame as the sun sank and the air grew cool. His breath would rise in silent clouds while his hands rested on his hammer's handle. Instead of praising his own abilities, he was comparing his growth to the mental image that had been presented to him that night of stars and silence. There was still a lot to accomplish. Over time, the whispers of the villagers evolved. Some questioned whether Noah was aware of something they were not. Others described him as a man who was too consumed by his own thoughts and let his crops to flourish while he worked on a wood dream. Uneasy with the sight of something so out of place, some started to completely avoid the clearing. Others, though fewer, nevertheless, took a peculiar solace in walking by. In their own way, the steady work, the leisurely pace, and the sound of hammers at twilight were comforting in a world that seemed more and more restless. Noah's wife would bring water and food to the workplace on days when the wind was light. The family would eat outdoors together after she placed them on a towel laid out on a smooth wood. Though it never got too loud, the sons would occasionally laugh along as if they could feel the weight of what they were creating, even though they could not yet see its conclusion. Noah would whisper about the next beam to be cut and the next plank to be fitted in between mouthfuls of bread. Every lesson was delivered with the same patience he showed them. When he showed them how to fix a roof or tend to the crops. The ark grew season after season. The walls turned into compartments, and the frame became into walls. Every plank was carefully laid, and every seam was sealed to withstand the future. Views of the valley's green folds, the silver arc of the stream, and the far-off line where the earth and sky meet were all visible from the top of the rising edifice. Noah would occasionally stop there and watch the clouds move across that line while leaning against the wood. The ark attracted attention, even though it was incomplete. Its enormity alone was enough to pique interest, but it also carried with it an implicit assurance that its purpose went beyond the sum of its parts. Despite their disbelieving smiles or shakes of their heads, the villagers kept coming back to witness it. They seemed to care about the slow, steady work that was taking place there, even though they had no idea why. The days went on, characterized by the steady cadence of tools, the aroma of freshly chopped wood, and the quiet muttering of those who came to see. Under the hands of a man who did not hurry or turn away, the ark rose inch by inch, beam by beam, for he held within him the serene confidence that he was not alone in the task at hand. The growing frame of the ark was no longer a silent mystery at the valley's edge. Even from the hills, its bent timber ribs could be seen reaching toward the sky like the bones of some enormous beast. People walking along the outer walkways were unable to avoid stopping, their gazes drawn to the building that appeared to expand with each lunar phase. The tall figures of the Nephilim, whose shadows stretched across the field as they arrived to observe what Noah was constructing, were among the onlookers in addition to farmers and traders. Some showed up with the easy assurance of hunters who had no fear of the land. They smiled at the sight as they stood with their arms crossed at the margins of the clearing. In a deep, carrying voice, one might exclaim, "What will it do? Is it going to walk to the sea?" And then there would be laughter, loud and unbridled, rolling across the valley like distant thunder. Like the painted clay pots or woven clothing they occasionally saw in the marketplaces, Noah's creations appeared to them to be innocuous oddities, another human diversion. They didn't perceive any threat or cause for alarm. They didn't all laugh, though. Some giants had eyes that remained on the ark with a more inquisitive gaze. Although they didn't say much, their quiet was powerful in and of itself. Some stood apart from their friends, heads cocked slightly as though they were trying to comprehend, arms hanging loosely at their sides. Despite their strength and bulk, there was a certain uneasiness in their eyes. They felt a change, like the wind before a storm, but they weren't precisely scared. Back then, the air itself seemed different. Although it was invisible, it was felt, particularly by people who had spent a lot of time on this planet. The morning light was clearer. The evenings seemed to last longer, containing a silence that was neither quite tranquil nor completely disturbed. Birds circled and called, then disappeared into the distance in unfamiliar patterns. After unexpected intense rains, streams that had previously been clear occasionally ran with a slight fog. There were rumors among the humans. Some talked about dreams they couldn't shake, visions of trees swaying beneath a dark sky, thoughts of water rising beyond the hills. Others acknowledged experiencing insomnia and waking up during the night for no apparent reason. The Nephilim heard these whispers and looked at them with a mix of annoyance and laughter. Some giants thought such debate was pointless and unworthy of their time. Others saw it as just another indication that the world was shifting in a direction they were unable to identify. 3 of the giants came up to Noah and his sons one afternoon as they were working on a portion of the hull. The workers' tools paused for a heartbeat as their footsteps caused the ground to shake quietly. The trio's leader had broad shoulders and sunlight-glinting hair that resembled burnished copper. His face was unreadable as he gently scanned the ark. "Why?" he questioned plainly, in a deep but non-aggressive voice. As he responded, Noah continued to work. "Because it needs to be completed." He spoke steadily, without protest or entreaty. As though the response weren't sufficient, the behemoth scowled. "For what purpose?" Noah carefully tapped a peg into place and stated, "For what is coming." The other 2 giants looked at each other. One of them shook his head and snorted quietly. In an almost indulgent tone, he stated, "Nothing comes that we cannot stand against." They stayed a little longer, seeing the steady effort, and then they turned away, returning swiftly to the hills with their strides. The copper-haired one was the only one to glance back once, his brow wrinkled as if the image were stuck in his head. Not every visit was so serene. Some days, groups of younger giants arrived for fun and threw stones at the worksite to demonstrate their strength rather than cause harm. If they wanted to, they would brag about how quickly they could destroy such a creature. Long after they had left, their piercing laughing continued into the evening. However, neither Noah nor his sons ever responded to their jeering. As if the taunts were no more than the sound of the wind through the trees, the labor continued. There was a slight but increasing tension between the 2 worlds, the builders and the spectators. Despite their strength, the giants had long seen themselves as the land's rulers. They took what they wanted, hunted where they wanted, and had no fear of animals. The ark, however, was unique. It appeared to be apart from them, unaffected by their domination, even though it did not pose a threat to their authority through conflict or territory. Some of them were more uneasy about that silent resistance than they wanted to acknowledge. Noah occasionally glanced toward the far-off ridges in the nights after the tools had been put away and the light had turned to gold. Even though they were far away, he could tell they were observing. For a moment, tall shadows would emerge against the sky, frozen in place, and then vanish into the encroaching darkness. From a distance, he could not hear their voices, but he could sense the weight of their stares. The uneasiness was not always evident to the Nephilim themselves. Some only experienced it in little ways, such as a brief diversion during a hunt or a pause when they noticed the moon's shaky reflection in a pool. Others experienced it more acutely, as though the earth itself were moving. Some whispered about the nightmares that plagued their sleep, about the valleys and woodlands being engulfed by infinity of water, about how their height was insufficient to keep them above the flood. They kept these dreams to themselves because doing so would show a weakness in their pride. The ark continued to grow. Its frame widened, its beams lifted higher. As constant as the earth's heartbeat, the sound of hammers reverberated throughout the valley. The giants came and went, some silent, some contemplative, some teasing. They were unable to ignore it, but they were also unable to fully comprehend it. And as though the world itself were holding its breath, the air became heavier in that liminal area between comprehension and denial. At first, the changes in the days were so minor that few people paid much attention to them. Even while the sky was still blue, there was a slight smell of rain in the air, a wetness that clung to the skin. It was quieter in the mornings. The typical bird chatter appeared uncertain, with fewer calls and more unpredictable flights. The trees' leaves hung motionless in the weird, oppressive silence, no longer rustling freely. When a shadow moved across the valley, farmers stopped what they were doing and looked up to find a single cloud floating where the sky had been clear. One cloud led to another, then still another. Pale gray streaks started to appear in the far horizon over the course of a few days, as if a curtain in the distance were gradually being drawn. The warmth of the sun grew softer as its light was filtered through a veil that grew thicker every morning. By the afternoon, the hills were covered in shadows that had arrived too early and lasted well into the evening. The temperature dropped, the sort of drop that was a silent warning. The animals started to move at that point, not in frenzied flight, not in swarms, but in a silent, purposeful procession. When the deer emerged from the woods, they did so with placid eyes and ears that turned toward an invisible call rather than danger. Birds landed on the ark's expanding structure after descending from their lofty vantage points and flying low over the grass. Pairs of waterfowl waddled along the short roads from the marshes, and sheep wandered aimlessly from the far hills. As the first of these pairings came, Noah and his family silently watched. Without pausing, a fox and its partner, their coats shiny and smooth, strode up the hill to the entrance of the ark. Doves, with their delicate feathers hardly moths, oving in the air, followed them. As though drawn by the same unseen thread, even animals that were rarely seen, the silent lynx, shy hares, and wild boar, came into view. For the time being, it appeared that the woodlands and valleys that had supported these animals for many generations were willing to let them go. There was always the sound of movement in the underbrush and grass at night. Noah's sons could see animal silhouettes moving in pairs toward the ark by torchlight, their motions deliberate but slow. The tall giants who continued to observe from a distance did not appear to frighten them or cause them to scatter when they were approached. When the Nephilim saw this odd movement, they became silent. The image of predators and prey walking side by side, each keeping pace without arguing, was too much for even the most sarcastic of them to chuckle at. Now the sky changed faster. The clouds knitted themselves together until they extended uninterrupted from horizon to horizon as the grayness increased. Occasionally, a distant grumble of thunder would rumble, too weak to be a storm yet too certain to be disregarded. The earth's browns and grasses' greens became dimmer, as if the planet itself were fading into darkness, and the light became more subdued. A restless wind that seemed to carry both salt and soil, as if it had crossed both sea and mountain, started to blow across the land. It was not the warm breath of spring or the piercing bite of winter. It disturbed the surface of streams without creating waves, and it shook the leaves without ripping them. The actual rivers appeared to flow more quickly, their waters carrying a murky sediment that they had never carried before. More people watched the larger monsters arrive than any previous time. The big elephants arrived from the low plains, walking in a sedate, steady beat with swinging trunks. The lions and lionesses came out of the thick ease, their golden eyes unblinking as they went by human houses without even looking. While pairs of eagles flew overhead before descending to perch among the beams of the ark, bears lumbered down narrow ridges, their enormous paws silent on the ground. Torn between amazement and terror, children hid under their mothers' robes to observe. Even the village elders had slowed their speech, turning their customary arguments and tales into silent gazes at the sky. The eerie silence that had descended upon the earth made every sound, both the thump of hooves and the whisper of wings, seem more intense. This assembly was also observed by the Nephilim. Some went amid the animals that were arriving, their enormous bodies creating lengthy shadows that covered both oxen and deer. As they went by, they caressed the large animals' sides, amazed that they did not back down. Others stood away, their gazes straying from the ark to the gathering clouds overhead. Despite their pride, they also sensed that this was the response to a call they were unable to hear, rather than the haphazard ramblings of the earth's creatures. The first drops started to fall when the gentle sounds of breathing creatures filled the lower rooms of the ark. Initially, they were light, strewn across wood and leaves with the softest taps, as if the sky were merely weighing itself. But there was much more offered by the clouds above. The aroma of deep water, swollen rivers beyond their borders, and restless seas in their depths was carried by the drops. Instead of wandering randomly, the wind now pushed steadily, bending grasses and stirring cloaks as it swept the valley in a single direction. A tense stillness pervaded the air, a hush that resembled the interval before a note is struck. More creatures arrived, their eyes gleaming in the gloom, their fur and feathers wet by the increasing mist. And the horizon vanished behind a wall of darker cloud as the final pairs made their way across the slope toward the ark. The day grew darker, not to twilight, but to a looming darkness that seemed to be pressing down on the ground. The distant thunder's voice, rolling long and deep through the hills, became more distinct. They were hit by the storm's first real breath. As if the sky had opened a calm, patient wound, the rain fell steadily and endlessly instead of in a furious rage. Even while each drop was gentle, taken as a whole, they created a veil that obscured the hills and trees, making everything appear to be covered in silver. There was always the sound, a faint hiss when it hit the swollen streams, a patter on leaves, a whispering on rooftops. It was something deeper, a weight that descended upon every surface and every heart, rather than the cacophonous storm that many would have envisioned. At first, the ground gulped the water down into its parched soil. Puddles developed in the spaces between stones, in the furrows of the fields, and in the tracks of both humans and animals. Once meandering softly between their banks, the rivers started to rise, their margins extending into the grass. There was only the calm, measured flow of water that appeared to know it would not be stopped. No wave rushed in, no unexpected crash. Inside the ark, Noah and his family worked quietly and diligently, shutting doors and caring for the animals while speaking quietly to avoid upsetting the peace that had descended upon even the most untamed of creatures. The fragrance of deep earth and moist wood filled the air outside. The only movement in the villages that had previously hummed with the beat of everyday life was the unceasing fall of silver threads from the rain. The Nephilim's enormous shapes were obscured against the gray as they stood in the broad fields, the drips cascading down their arms and faces. Their voices went hushed as the hours became days and the days became an uninterrupted blur of falling water. Initially, they had joked as the rain started, referring to it as a passing season. They saw the trails disappear beneath small, rippling ponds as the rivers surged across the lowlands and climbed the banks. Sensing the difference outside, the animals in the ark moved and muttered in their enclosures. Some huddled together, their heat rising in the cool air like a thin mist. The heads of birds were tucked under their wings. The sound of a distant tree cracking, a huge trunk buckling beneath the weight of wind and water, would occasionally float through the rain. The houses closest to the streams were the first to be affected by the flood. Water lapped at entrances and pooled across dirt floors as it slipped in without causing any harm. Those who stayed in the villages were forced to relocate to higher rooms, their footfall making a gentle splashing sound. Even the cries of frightened voices sounded muffled, as if they were being spoken into cloth, as the rain drowned out all other sounds. At first, the giants' great strides carried them above the creeping flood, allowing them to easily wade through the swelling waters. But as the days went by, the water grew deeper, eclipsing fences, climbing over stones, and reaching even the tallest of them at the knees. Once high hills now resembled little islands, their slopes vanishing into the gray distance. The distinctions between lake and field, between river and road, became hazy until they vanished completely. The world outside the ark was a changing reflection, with water rippling in all directions beneath the unceasing rain. An everlasting meeting of cloud and sea replaced the once clear horizon. Every breath carried the taste of the flood, and the air itself felt altered, heavy, with dampness. Despite their strength, the Nephilim were unable to control the waterways. Some attempted to scale the mountain's stony spines and ridges, which stood out against the pitch-black sky. Others, their feet uncertain and hesitant, waded forward into the swelled plains. Once thunderous, the sound of their movements was now lost in the immense silence, which included the low slap of waves against wood and the steady hum of the rain. Days went by with neither the sun nor the stars to measure them. The light was neither completely day nor night, and the sky stayed a single shade of dimmer. With the calm assurance of a tide that had forgotten how to turn back, the waters rose, not in huge surges. First, forests vanished, their leaves floating away like tiny green boats as their canopies sank beneath the surface. Then, without much of a stir, the tallest roofs were taken. With their faces illuminated by the faint light coming through the rain, Noah's sons stood guard through tiny gaps in the ark's walls. They watched as the Nephilim's numbers decreased and the final tall branches vanished. In the distance, a few giants remained still with the water up to their chests and their heads cocked toward the sky, as though they were looking for something above the clouds. Others advanced gradually in the direction of the higher regions, their forms disappearing into the haze until nothing was left except the boundless water. The rain hammering softly against the roof and more firmly when the wind increased was a constant sound within the ark. The big vessel rocked in long, leisurely sways at night as the ocean underneath them moved gently. As they became used to this pattern, the animals' movements became more relaxed and their breathing synchronized with the rise and fall. The family slept in shifts and their mutual stillness said louder than words could. The flood was a long, dry breath of the earth, a slow covering of everything that had been known, rather than a single moment of catastrophe. One by one, landmarks vanished until there was no shore to name and no route to remember. Water was all that was left, stretching endlessly, interrupted only by the wooden frame of the ark and the dim outlines of far-off hills that were now too little to be real. The rain did not roar or shout, it muttered. From the first to the last day it fell with the same gentle persistence, each drop a part of an endless, unbroken chain. Under its gentle hand, both the large and the small disappeared from view as the days stretched into weeks, leaving behind nothing but the silence of an unending sea. When the last of the rain finally fell, there was a silence so profound that it seemed as though the ground itself was holding its breath, rather than a commotion or sudden brightness. Once thick and unbroken, the clouds dwindled into a hazy, whitish veil, their edges melting into the horizon. It was so quiet that the slightest sound seemed to reverberate for miles. Reflecting the subdued sky above, the water's surface lay flat as polished stone. The ark rocked slowly as it sailed across the boundless emptiness. There was no wave, no agitated movement, no bird called in the distance, and no wind brushed the sails. The world appeared to be devoid of movement, as if time had decided to stop. Noah's family looked through small gaps inside the ark for any indication of change. Although the silence was not oppressive, it did have a weight, the type that results from the passing of something enormous and incalculable. They were all aware that beneath the quiet river, beyond the wooden walls, was a new world, invisible to the naked eye. There was a lovely rhythm to life inside. The creatures moved slowly, had calm gaze, and only stirred when needed. Now a familiar kampa, neon. The creak of the ark's planks assured them of their safety. A lot of the time, Noah would sit silently with his hands in his lap and his gaze focused on the white sky. He was a man used to work, to days when the sound of tools and other voices filled the air. But here, all he could hear was his family's gentle breath and the constant, quiet sound of the water against the hull. Morning and evening were indistinguishable from one another. Subtly, the light changed from silver to gold, but the days seemed to have no boundaries. Shem or Japheth would occasionally lean over the edge and look into the enormous mirror below. Sky and cloud, cloud and sky, their own faces staring back at them as if they were asking the same silent question: how long? The reflection was the same every time. When Noah released a dove for the first time, its wings pierced the quiet like a soft sigh. For a brief while, everyone's gaze followed the bird with wordless hope as it rose into the air, its white feathers catching the faint light. Its tiny form was engulfed by the cloud as it flew in ever-widening loops before vanishing over the horizon. After several hours, it reappeared, settling on Noah's arm with a gentle flutter of its wings. It was not yet time, yet the sight conveyed a silent, unspoken understanding. The land was still dominated by the oceans somewhere out of their line of sight. Days went by in the same silence. The light, which now broke through the thin clouds, warmed the ark's boards as it swayed gently. Only the patience of waiting was present. There was no hurry or sense of haste. The dove did not return empty-beaked the second time it was sent out. A fresh olive leaf, green and flecked with drops, sat in the gentle curve of its mouth. Despite its modest size and fragility, it had the promise that land had emerged from the depths someplace in its color and shape. In reverent quiet, Noah's fingers brushed the silky leaf as he held it in his palms like a jewel. The atmosphere started to shift. There was a slight smell about it: soil, rich, dam, pea, living earth. As though it came and went with the changing light, the family only saw it during peaceful times. As if something below stirred and sighed, the sea's calm started to break, not with waves, but with the smallest of motions. Every now and then, a ripple would move up the side of the ark, briefly glinting in the sunshine, before disappearing once more into the emptiness. The third time the dove was released, it failed to return. Its tiny form vanished over the horizon's pale line, carried off in an invisible direction. Noah looked down after he had observed it till it was but a memory against the fading sky. He had a deep-seated sense that the bird had found a home, and that their own time on the river would soon come to an end. The next few days were full of little clues. The sun hung higher in the sky, painting the water a gentle gold in the evenings as the temperature rose. The shadows of the clouds drifted languidly across the surface as they traveled faster. The family noticed that they were glancing out more frequently, following the horizon in search of the first sign of land. The animals also appeared to notice it. Birds in cages fluttered their wings more energetically, and some of the beasts paced slowly, as if they missed the sensation of the ground underneath. They noticed it, a black, dim line far away, one morning when the sky was open and the light was clear. It was a solid, immobile object rather than a cloud or shadow. They were moved by the sight, but they didn't talk much about it since they wanted to cherish the moment. The line sharpened over the days, rising from the sea like a sleeping giant. They got closer as the ark drifted slowly, and the smell of the land filled the air. The quiet persisted even then. The air was devoid of seabird cries and the thunderous crash of waves on the coast, just the peaceful breathing of people within, and the constant, gentle clatter of water against wood. That silence, which comes after a huge storm when everyone waits for life to start over, was not born of emptiness, but rather of serenity. Finally anchored on the slopes of a secluded mountain, the ark rested softly. Its velocity slowed gradually, like a sigh sinking into the air, but there was no start or abrupt stop. They took their time leaving. Instead, they waited as the floods gradually receded, exposing the pale bones of trees that had survived the flood, as well as stone and dirt, as well as the first greens of new growth. The horizon appeared to extend longer during those peaceful days, as though the earth had been cleared and made wider. Frequently, Noah stood on the deck, his eyes searching the distance where the dove had flown, the breeze gentle in his beard. Life was starting over somewhere, as soft and certain as the sunrise. High among the peaceful mountain slopes, the ark rested steadily after its protracted trip. For the first time in many months, there was a sense of complete silence beneath their feet, as the timbers no longer creaked under the force of the floods. This time, the air felt different, pure and thin, with a keen freshness that seemed to permeate the heart just as much as the lungs. The ridges were painted in bright gold by the sunlight that now flowed freely over them after the storms had passed and the clouds had broken. Noah remained on the deck for a long time, taking in the view of distant peaks with green streaks running along their sides where the first shoots had started to poke their heads above the ground. Pockets of land, resembling little islands strewn throughout a huge sea, were left behind while the water below resumed its gradual retreat. Some had already been touched by life, while others were raw stone, gleaming with dampness. Shuddering in the slight breeze, delicate blades of grass pushed through the ground. The petals of flowers caught the morning sun as if embracing a new world, and here and there, the pale forms dared to open. The perfume of beginning. Things permeated the air as well, full of the clear clarity of the mountaintops, the subtle sweetness of blossoms, and the damp scent of soil. With gratitude, the family's feet touched the sturdy deck as they ventured out a bit further each day. The earth itself appeared to be calling to them after they had not felt anything but the soft sway of the ark for such a long time. Leaning over the side, Shem would point out the little valleys that were now visible between the slopes. Ham would see where streams, their silvery pathways gleaming against the rock, had started to trickle down from melting snow. Japheth would inhale deeply while raising his gaze to the sky, seemingly learning its unclouded blue expanse by heart. There was a fresh restlessness among the animals inside the ark. The birds' calls became louder as they flapped their wings against their confines, sensing the open air. Smelling the aroma of fresh vegetation, the larger creatures moved slowly, their nostrils twitching. Noah could relate to their desire because he had the same pull, a draw toward the land and the open area beyond the wooden walls. However, They did not hurry because patience had been their constant friend for so long. Knowing that every day brought the waters down and that every daybreak showed a bit more of the land they would soon be walking on, they watched and waited. Noah stepped outside with a silent sense of reverence as the slopes surrounding them finally stood strong and dry. Under his sandals, the dirt felt cold and soft, and a slight breeze blew through the grass, bringing with it the aroma of fresh life. Only the distant trickle of a secret brook disturbed the profound and serene calm that surrounded the mountains. After so long waiting, it seemed as if the entire world had stopped to observe this initial stride, this silent claiming of the land. In a calm order, the animals followed. Cries reverberated off the mountain cliffs as birds soared into the air in a flurry of wings. Others darted for the valleys below, where trees stood like green beacons and water glistened, while others scattered in all directions, some circling far above. The animals walked more slowly, their hefty feet digging into the soggy ground. Some raised their heads to the wind, breathing in the strange smells with their eyes half closed. Others immediately started to graze, nibbling at the delicate sprouts that had emerged in the warmth of the sun. Instead of anarchy, there was a slow, tranquil return of life to the land. With their eyes wide as they absorbed the scenery, Noah's family dispersed along the slope. Mist softened the ridges of the mountains as they drifted away in all directions. Green blanketed the floors of fertile, wide valleys. Streams glinted in the sun like glass threads as they carved silver lines across the lowlands. Clusters of young trees stood here and there, their leaves bright and new. It was a place that had never been touched by humans and had the innocence of a new day. The sky itself seems to exult in silent beauty. With their gentle white outlines against the deep blue, clouds drifted languidly. Steam was drawn from the damp dirt by the continuous warmth of the sunlight. An eagle's cry echoed far above, a single sound that conveyed freedom and vast authority. The weight of the past, the flood, the protracted waiting, the quiet of the waters, and the wonder of what was ahead of them were both palpable in that moment. Here, the evenings were mild. The air cooled and shadows gently moved across the hills as the sun sank below the peaks. The smoke from the little fire would curl upward into the calm air as the family gathered around it. They spoke softly and sparingly since they seemed to be experiencing more tea than words could express. Frequently they just listened to the subtle murmur of water concealed in the rocks, to the rustle of grass in the wind, to the silent footsteps of animals retiring for the night. The stars came shining back, clear and unclouded. They appeared closer than before, as if they were bending down to keep an eye on the Earth's resurrection. The moon moved slowly across the sky, illuminating the slopes with silver light as the constellations shimmered above the shadowy mountain outlines. At times, Noah would sit apart and look up with a sense of peace that came from understanding that this was not only the end of something, but the start of everything that was ahead. They started to investigate the area in the days that followed. They passed through forests where the leaves murmured above them and pastures where the grass reached their knees. They discovered ponds where fish darted in silvery flashes and streams so clean that the stones below appeared polished. Every new finding seemed like a present given to them, as though the ground itself were giving away its riches. Despite being new, the world held the silent remembrance of what had been lost, which served as a warning to step carefully. They started to consider creating a life for the heart here, amidst the valleys and slopes, rather than only shelters for the body. The air was fragrant, the water ample, and the earth fertile. Under a sky that seemed bigger than any they had ever seen, they were able to grow and harvest, raise flocks, and move freely. It was all in front of them, open and vast, waiting to be shaped. Thus, the fresh ground was stretched out at their feet, unspoiled and ready, a place where each stride was unique and each breath smelled of fresh starts. The younger ones would occasionally lean closer to Noah, their eyes full of inquiry, around the evening fire after the day. As work was finished, and the chilly air had gently settled over the countryside. They desired to hear stories in their entirety, but they had only heard bits and pieces, whispered phrases heard as elders spoke in low tones. Thus, with years of patience smoothed out, Noah would talk about a time when the giants walked beneath the sun, a period before the oceans had taken over the earth, a time that seemed more like a shadow than a memory. He never started off angry or afraid. Rather, his voice had a subdued weight, as if every word had been carefully selected and molded to fit the brittle truth that persisted from those times. His description of their imposing height would be similar to that of mountains, immovable, huge, and uncanny to see, rather than being an attempt to brag about their might. Some of them were quite graceful, yet their steps were heavy and extended. Even if many of them had used their strength for violence, not all of them were vicious. Some held voices as deep as the sea's rolling waves, while others had eyes that mirrored the dawn sky. The kids listened intently, conjuring up ideas of nearly inconceivable creatures in their minds. Every time someone would inquire, "Were they all gone?" As if the solution might be concealed there, Noah's eyes would wander to the far-off hills. He never spoke anything with confidence. Even though the world was huge and had many mysterious nooks and crannies, the water had swept through every valley and engulfed every city. Finally, he would remark, "After the waters fell, we saw none." However, the world is vast, and the mountains are full of secrets. Occasionally, Shem would contribute his own memories. When they went through a marketplace, he recalled the weight of their presence, how people would retreat into the shadows, and the air would appear to silence for a heartbeat. He related the story of a giant with pale yellow hair, who once raised a beam so big that 20 men couldn't have moved it. He also related how the sound could be heard over the hills, and how someone once played a stringed instrument so big that it took both hands to strum a single chord. The tone of Ham's recollections was different. When he talked of the nights when the ground shook from the thumping of their feet, his voice would get quieter. He remembered how some giants became restless and began to explore the plains in large groups, their laughter resonating like distant thunder. He described seeing them in the last of the light, their forms silhouetted against the horizon, so big that it was momentarily difficult to distinguish between them and the mountains. Although Japheth told fewer anecdotes, he occasionally described the memories of their eyes, showing how some gazed downcast at the smaller people, while others had an expression that was nearly melancholy and filled with unsaid emotion. Though the weight of their strength had made them both feared and envied, he thought that not all of them had welcomed the depravity of their time. After these memories, Noah would frequently pause for a minute, as if sorting through memories that were too heavy to bear all at once. He would then talk once more in the gentle light of the fire, this time about the giants' demise rather than their strength. He described how several giants disregarded the warnings as it started to rain, standing in the open with their arms outstretched as if they were defying the sky itself. He related stories of people who attempted to scale the tallest heights, but the floods swiftly pursued them and rose higher than they could have ever imagined. Even back then, there were rumors that some people sought safety in caverns, but there was no concrete evidence of their fate because of the flood's gloom. The children listened with a curious mixture of wonder and sorrow. It was difficult to imagine creature as so big and powerful, gone as if they had never existed. Now their surroundings were peaceful, full of tiny animals, undulating hills, and trees that one could hold in one's arms. They were reminded that the world had once been different, wilder, and heavier with mysterious wonders, but the stories seemed to push against the boundaries of that tranquility. The youngsters would occasionally stray to the edge of the camp and look off into the distance when the moon was high and silver light spilled across the slopes. Their long shadows would spread out across the landscape as they pictured tall figures moving against the night. They would see slow, deep voices speaking in a language no one could recall being carried by the wind. The question reappeared in those moments: were they really gone? Noah never made an effort to dispel their awe. He allowed it to linger instead, realizing that not all of the world's mysteries could be cleanly resolved with simple answers. He reminded them that the stories were about more than just power. They were about the perils that arise when pride and strength are combined. He talked about the quiet virtues, including mercy, humility, and the kind of strength that flexes instead of snaps. He would whisper, "Remember that even the tallest of us can fall. Even the tiniest can remain upright." Noah would tell them about his first encounter with a giant on the few nights when the fire was low and the sky appeared to be endless. When a shadow covered the trail, he was still a young boy, strolling through the valleys with his father. He looked up to see a form that was different from what he had seen in his mind. Eyes that were clear and piercing, arms that resembled tree trunks, and a figure as broad as a gate. The sensation of being in front of something ancient, as if the earth itself had taken shape and learnt to walk, was what he recalled most, not the dread. He was reminded of the world's immense diversity, both its beauty and its peril, by that remembrance, not as a warning. These tales were ingrained in the Nuji narration's worldview from an early age. They discovered that the giants were a part of the earth's lengthy and complex past, in addition to being representations of the corruption of the past. Knowing that even those who fell had once been molded by the same hands that created all life, they spoke of them with a kind of gentle veneration. As a result, the camp would become quiet on evenings when the wind blew gently through the grass, conveying the distant cries of an invisible bird. The air would seem heavy with unsaid amazement, faces would turn to the stars, and the fire would crackle low. The truth may still be present somewhere beyond the mountains and woodlands, maybe in places none of them would ever visit, buried in deep valleys, dormant in abandoned caverns, or echoed in the voice of an old tale. The inquiry would linger, soft and unhurried, like a notion that never needed an answer, while the flames flickered against the darkness. Were they all gone? The air felt motionless, as if it were holding its breath, and the campfires blazed low under the still night sky. A silver veil of moonlight concealed the hills and valleys of Canaan, which extended in gentle shadows in the distance. The 12 men who had just returned from their long journey sat with their people around one particular fire. At first their voices were low, but everyone listened intently to what they had to say. The stories these spies brought back were unlike anything most people had ever heard, because they had been all around the promised country. Initially, they discussed the terrain itself, with undulating fields full of grain and vineyards laden with clusters of grapes so big that 2 men had to carry them on poles. They spoke about streams that shone even in the middle of the day, pomegranates that exploded with sweetness, and fig trees that bent under their own weight. The land was almost too bountiful, with the earth itself almost brimming with life. But there was a change in the atmosphere as they spoke. Their voices became slower and softer, as though they needed to be careful about what they were going to say. They described the inhabitants as being fierce, robust, and uncompromising. Some villages were encircled by walls that appeared to reach the sky. Then the words, "the sons of Enoch," were spoken, which caused the camp to become even more silent. As if they were referring to something older than the hills, the men spoke their names. They claimed that these were giants, taller than average men, with broad frames and long enough steps to quickly cross a clearing. Others moved aside without being asked as they passed through the streets. One of the spies remembered standing in the shadow of one of these figures, his face white even in the firelight. He used to consider himself a powerful guy, but now he felt like a child standing next to a tower. The giant's voice was deep and resonant, with each word rolling out like a steady rhythm, and his head rose well over his own, his chest like a wall. As if the air itself had swelled around him, the spy described how his legs felt heavy and how his voice was trapped somewhere between his throat and chest. Another described seeing them working in the fields from a distance. They were impressively tall, even when hunched over, and their arms moved with such force that the ground gave way easily to their pressure. They moved with a peculiar grace, as if they had been born to the ground they walked on, rather than being awkward due to their size. Some had armor that glinted in the sunlight, while others wore basic woven clothing. Some carried weapons that were too big for the average man to lift with one hand. The kids in the vicinity who were listening clutched to one another while trying to visualize such creatures with wide eyes. The elder ones looked at each other, their minds drifting back to the tales of the Nephilim and the giants before the flood that they had heard from their parents and grandparents. Are these their descendants? The name of Enoch stirred memories like wind through ancient leaves, and the connection was spoken in the darkness. According to several of the spies, they spotted entire families of them, not just one or two. They were so frequent in some towns that nobody seemed to be amazed by their height. Children who were already taller than most adult men played in the dust as mothers with eagle-like eyes watched from doors. Their laughter echoed slowly and rollingly down the streets. The spies pondered out loud whether these individuals had ever experienced fear, or if it was something that only those who gazed up at them experienced. Caleb and Joshua spoke differently, their eyes blazing with something unshakable, their voices steady. They spoke as if such things might be faced, but they did not dispute the existence of the giants or the power of their cities. Like individuals who had experienced danger yet were not depressed, they spoke simply and calmly. The land is good. However, the others' murmurs, which described feeling like grasshoppers, small, delicate, and easily crushed underfoot, nearly overshadowed what they had to say. The listeners' minds were deeply impacted by the visual. The heat from the fire cast long, languid shadows on the ground as the night drew on. As if the speakers were worn out from the tales recounting, the whispers became weaker. But the idea would not go away. Are the giants still able to move among them? How could these tall men still be standing under the same sky if the water had long since swept them away? Did the earth bring them forth again, or were they remnants, miraculously saved in secret valleys? The land of Canaan appeared to contain more than just rich soil and powerful towns, yet no one could be sure. It was heavy, a reminder of something that the world was not supposed to recall so readily. The children's dreams that night saw large forms moving slowly across verdant fields, their faces partially obscured by the light and their shadows extending far. Somewhere, in the quiet corners of their hearts, the people pondered whether they would one day see those identical shapes with their own awake eyes rather than in their dreams. With the slightest hint of dust and distant grasses, the night wind blew softly through the camp. Some people woke up under the stars, their minds divided between wonder and anxiety. As they walked those slopes, they pictured one of Enoch's sons cresting the ridge in front of them, towering like a tree and strolling with the serene confidence of someone who knows no equal. Maybe they wouldn't even look at them. Maybe they would stop and look slowly at the little traveler in front of them. The idea was enough to make one shiver, but not out of dread, but rather out of something more profound, a silent realization that there were still wonders in the world, both beautiful and awful, and that some of them might not have vanished yet. Old stories are told in voices that seem oddly familiar in places far from the verdant hills of Canaan. The Norse spoke of the Jotnar, enormous, powerful creatures whose footsteps might tremble the icy earth around mountain fires in the frigid north. Greek mythology described the powerful Titans, creatures that existed before the time of the Olympian gods and whose conflicts had the power to upend mountains and shake the seas in the shadow of the Mediterranean. There were rumors of tall heroes and mighty warriors who once sculpted the valleys and molded the rivers in the Far East, in the birthplace of China's ancient dynasties. The looks and names varied from culture to culture, but the themes remained the same. Creatures too big, too powerful, and too enigmatic to fit into the modern world. Scribes in Mesopotamia's enormous deserts carved their tales into clay, including tales of Gilgamesh, a monarch whose size and power were reputed to surpass that of common men, and who was supposed to be a combination of god and human. A guy whose immensity was equaled only by his feverish quest to discover the edge of the globe, he was regarded as a city builder and a secret seeker. According to ancient tablets, he had a voice deep enough to reverberate through stone hallways and walked with steps so large they appeared to span rivers. To the listeners of these stories, he was not wholly dissimilar to the characters mentioned in Whispers by Noah's descendants, who mentioned giants during a time when the earth was still young. Stories change but do not disappear as one moves south into the warm regions of Africa. There have been historical reports of exceptionally tall Zulu warriors who lived before the major tribal migrations. According to others, these creatures had eyes that were keen enough to detect a bird in the distant horizon and could see across valleys from one hill to another. There were also faint traditions of builders in Egypt where stone structures still cast their old shadows, whose arms could lift the large blocks with less effort than most people need to raise a basket of bread. The enormous statues that remain, with serene, unagitated expressions, make one question if they were intended to commemorate monarchs, gods, or something in between. Dispersed around the vast Pacific, the Polynesian islands have their own peaceful echoes. Some traditions tell of the kaupo'o, taller than the tallest palms, long-limbed creatures from faraway countries. When the seas were low, they were reported to trek from island to island, leaving behind stone platforms so big that people in later centuries questioned how they could have created them without iron tools or wheels. Instead of portraying them as conquerors, the stories portray them as nomads who eventually vanished into the ocean, leaving behind only a few songs and stones to signify their journey. Then, in the chilly American forests, legends of a people known to the Paiute as the Si-Te-Ka in Nevada, red-haired giants who supposedly existed long before the tribes conquered the land, continue to be passed down from elder to youngster. They were described as strong and ferocious, living in caverns and moving quickly in spite of their size. Some people wonder if the long, unusually shaped skulls discovered in Peru's hills were the heads of an ancient people who once gazed down on the valleys from higher altitudes than we do. These skulls are frequently explained by archaeologists as the product of ceremonial shaping, but the question of why this shaping was carried out remains unanswered. Relics that arouse curiosity can be found on almost every continent. Enormous bones discovered in fields that have been plowed, stones that have been carved and moved with a precision and weight that contemporary machinery can't equal, and old carvings of figures whose proportions are just a little bit out of the ordinary. In several instances, science has offered explanations. The carvings were significant, the stones were moved by teamwork and inventiveness, and the bones belonged to extinct species of huge animals. But the recurrence of great stories everywhere, in locations separated by decades and oceans, gives human history a peculiar rhythm, a faint heartbeat that thumps beneath the surface of our collective memory. It's possible that the feeling that the world was once weirder, bigger, and less defined is what attracts people to these stories in addition to the possibility of giants themselves. These days, maps depict the entire planet, including the names of all the mountains and the locations of all the rivers. However, horizons were uncertain in the ancient past, and something powerful and invisible might have been hiding behind each far hill. The awe that ancient humans experienced when confronted with the enormity of existence was given form by giants, whether they were made of flesh and bone or were the product of pure imagination. It is tempting to draw parallels with the Nephilim tale in Genesis. Could the sons of Enoch have been a part of this larger fabric, recollected in tales from other places as well as in Hebrew history? Or did people just keep telling the same story because they are attracted to the notion that there is something bigger than themselves on the planet? Both options have merit, and they both let the listener sit by the fire in silence while gazing into the darkness beyond the flames and imagining the sound of heavy footsteps just out of sight. The archaeological clues resemble strewn-about pieces of a long-demolished building. In the Peruvian mountains, a huge gateway rises to a height that dwarfs a normal person. In isolated regions of Asia, there are enormous handprints that are believed to have been etched into solid rock. Tools that are too big for human hands to handle comfortably have been discovered in the Balkans, though it's unclear what they were employed for. Although there are explanations for each of these discoveries, ritual, artistic, or natural formation, none of them are sufficient to fully shut the case. The faint trace of a larger inquiry remains for each logical response. The pattern persists even in the more sedate regions of Europe. The Fomorians were seafaring giants with a combination of human and monstrous characteristics who fought the Tuatha De Danann in conflicts so old that they read more like dream memories than war records, according to Irish folklore. Local folklore has frequently associated these enormous beings with the standing stones found throughout the British Isles, many of which were too heavy for early technology to move. Some claim that the giants used them to play games of strength or fling them across the terrain as marks. It's hard to determine if the consistent recurrence of these tales throughout cultures is an indication of reality, a common imagination, or a combination of the two. However, it is simple to imagine them in the stillness of an evening when the contemporary cacophony subsides and the imagination is free to roam. Long shadows shifting against the horizon, individuals whose size looks almost surreal, but whose presence seems incredibly familiar. More than just bone and stone, the past is still present in the stories we continue to tell, even when we can no longer recall why. And maybe the truth waits, as patient as the ground itself, somewhere in the uninterrupted line of those tales. The Book of Enoch, which has been preserved in its whole in the ancient Ethiopian tradition, unfolds like a secret room inside the greater narrative, where the faint contours of Genesis are shown in more precise lines with richer details and a deeper tone. It describes the mighty creatures that formerly roamed among humans and the punishment that resulted from their disobedience, speaking not just of the world before the flood, but also of the heavens themselves. The watchers in its pages are not far-off, intangible entities. Rather, they are real, living individuals who left their positions in the heavenly order to interact with human daughters. Their descent is depicted as a purposeful crossing, a rupture between worlds that ought to have remained distinct, rather than as an ambiguous occurrence. No mortal eye could mistake them for anything earthly because they are characterized as majestic, bright beings that are clad in light. It is believed that their looks preserved the recollection of their origins, while their voices carried the profundity of the wind across mountains. Nevertheless, despite their strength and beauty, they were drawn to what they perceived below: humanity, brittle and transient, yet with a certain allure that even these creatures could not withstand. According to Enoch, they descended together while being bound by an oath taken on the summit of Mount Hermon, which said that everyone would be held accountable if one of them committed this atrocity. Their children, a race large in stature and restless in spirit, were born from their marriage with mortal women and were unlike either parent. With startling rust, avidity, they devoured the produce of the soil before turning to devouring the very life that surrounded them. The cries of the oppressed reached the heavens as violence spread like a shadow. Not just people suffered, the land itself appeared to be moaning beneath the weight of this filth. Instead of providing guidance and protection, the Watchers had brought forbidden knowledge, the secrets of metals and colors, enchantments, the reading of signs in the stars, and warcraft into the world. Creation's equilibrium faltered beneath the pressure. The response from above persists in the Book of Enoch. The heavenly courts are described, along with a vision of thrones that shine like molten gold, rivers of fire that flow between their steps, and angelic hosts who stand in numbers as endless as the sea's sands. The Ancient of Days is seated in the middle, his throne ablaze with flames, his hair like pure wool, and his garment as white as snow. The voices of countless people worshiping his name ceaselessly fill the air before him, creating a sound that like the deep hum of the universe itself. The scene is depicted as if every breath and action in that court had the power to change the course of history. It is not rushed. The angels who had seen the earthly destruction entered this court. They talked of the bloodshed, the innocent people's cries, and the conceit of those who had served as their brothers, and judgment was proclaimed by the Ancient of Days, whose eyes resembled blazing flames. Until the day of their ultimate reckoning, the Watchers were to be shackled and imprisoned in shadowy locations far beneath the mountains. There would be no return to the heights that the leader among them, identified in the text as Semyaza, had left behind. For teaching humanity how to make armor and how to use weapons of war, another, Azazel, was singled out and given a more severe fate. He was banished into the woods, tied hand and foot, and coated in sharp stones till the end of time. In this story, the guy the book is named for, Enoch, turns into a messenger. The angels lead him on a voyage beyond the boundaries of the human world, past tall mountains whose summits disappear into clouds, across abysses that sparkle with fire, and into corridors where the ceiling shimmers with endless light and the floor shines like crystal. He sees the prisons where the winds are imprisoned until their assigned time, the storehouses of snow and hail, and the location where the stars maintain their predetermined routes. The worlds above and below in these visions are not far-off abstractions. Rather, they are actual locations, as tangible as the ground beneath one's feet, teeming with powerful and purposeful beings. Enoch is instructed to deliver a message to the Watchers who sent for him in the hopes that he will beg for their release when he stands in front of the throne. However, the response he receives is definitive. Their request will not be fulfilled because their transgression was the result of deliberate decision rather than ignorance. The words are harsh, but they contain no cruelty, only the unwavering assurance of justice. In order for future generations to comprehend how quickly the harmony between heaven and earth might be upset and how seriously such a breach is addressed, Enoch is tasked with documenting these events. Later in the passage, the heavenly court is depicted once more, but with even more vivid imagery. Enoch sees the great glory sitting on his throne, the wheels, inside wheels turning with eyes that see everywhere, and the cherubim and seraphim circling like living flames. Before the throne, a river that is more brilliant than molten silver splits into streams that traverse the whole creation. At the voice of the one speaking from the core, the pillars of heaven quake, and the air itself appears to glow. Here, the record of the Watchers. Punishment is preserved in books that are off-limits to mortal hands. The uprising of the Watchers is depicted in the Book of Enoch as a crack in the cosmic order and a warning that is ingrained in the world's memory. However, it also offers glimpses of beauty, such as valleys where the light is brighter than day but softer than dawn, mountains from which sweet-smelling mists rise, and gardens with trees whose leaves glisten like gold. These views contrast with the Watchers' gloomy detention facilities, which are caverns devoid of light and where their bodies are bound together by chains like molten ore. The contrast between the splendor of the location they left and the desolation of the one they selected is stark. The Ethiopian tradition views this book as an essential component of the greater story, a reminder that the world's story extends beyond the visible surface, rather than as an odd anecdote. It suggests that the pre-flood events were the product of a deeper rebellion that started among creatures who had formerly walked in the presence of endless light, rather than just human immorality. It gives voice to a world where heaven and earth are tied by a past that is both wonderful and sad, a history that still speaks to those who are prepared to listen in its evocative descriptions and sobering cautions. The images from Enoch's visions, vast halls of fire and crystal, rivers of living light, chains buried deep in the soil, and a throne from which justice flows as definitely as a river to the sea, remain even in the silence of night, when everything appears small and quiet. The watchers, confined until the day the court rises again, wait somewhere in the invisible depths. Beyond the weight of ancient history, the enigma surrounding the Nephilim is characterized by both wonder and caution. It develops as a mirror, reflecting not just what was, but also what is possible if specific choices are made. Their story tells of hubris that grew too great, of boundaries violated carelessly for the order they upset, and of the slow but inevitable rot that occurs when authority becomes unbalanced with humility. Pride, not the kind of self-respect that makes one stand upright, but the kind that bends inward and sees only oneself, was the seed from which their demise sprang. According to the narratives that have survived, they wanted more than just power. They wanted greater authority, more prestige, and more authority over things that were never supposed to belong to them. Unbridled hunger pulled them to decisions that tarnished the land and shattered the balance between the visible and invisible. Corruption frequently starts out inconspicuously. Instead of announcing itself with drumming, it enters as a whisper and presents a gift that seems innocuous or even practical. For the Nephilim and their predecessors, the Watchers, this manifested as forbidden knowledge, secrets of craft, power, and dominance over others. By themselves, these objects weren't bad, but when used carelessly, they turned into destructive instruments. This embodies an ancient truth. The good thing done in the wrong way or at the wrong moment can be the thing that brings us to ruin. Modern life has its own subtle gifts that can weaken the spirit if not handled carefully, even though we may not be subject to the temptations of celestial knowledge or the strength of giants. On the other hand, humility is the silent power that keeps us from falling apart. The ability to view ourselves clearly and appreciate our value without thinking of ourselves as superior to the order that keeps the world together is not weakness. Whereas pride creates barriers between oneself and other people, humility makes actions possible. Instead of trying to control it, it is the voice that declares, "I am a part of something larger," and finds happiness there. Given their height and might, the Nephilim had no natural reason to bow low, but maybe that was the lesson that was intended to be observed. The more powerful one is, the more one must bow down before something higher. Like a silent stream, faith also runs through this tale. Noah's faith stood in sharp contrast to the violent times when the world was rife. Despite not being as big or strong as the Nephilim, he had a trust that remained unbroken despite the chaos all around him. Faith is the choice to stick to what is right even when all the other forces are pulling in different directions. It is not naive optimism. Faith becomes more than just a belief in our own world, where chaos and uncertainty frequently overpower quiet. It becomes a posture of endurance, a means of navigating storms without losing sight of our identity. Pride, corruption, humility, and faith are themes that are not exclusive to the past. These days, they coexist with us in smaller but no less significant forms. Pride may appear as the unrelenting quest to surpass others, to gauge one's value solely by achievement, and to disregard the unspoken reality that integrity, rather than accolades, is what gives life its worth. Cutting corners when no one is looking, defending harm because it advances a personal agenda, and allowing minor concessions to develop into routines are all examples of corruption. Humility can also be demonstrated in simple ways, such as deciding to assist without taking credit, listening intently to others, and expressing regret without becoming defensive. Similarly, faith is nourished by the constant rhythm of trust, confidence in light even when the sky is cloudy, trust in good even while wrong exists. Although it is easy to assume that, The problems we face now are very different from those of the ancient world. They are fundamentally the same. The story of the Nephilim serves as a warning about the consequences of exercising strength without empathy, pursuing knowledge without conscience, and allowing ability to become unanchored by wisdom. Today's giants are riches, power, and technology, and like ancient creatures, they can be utilized to create or destroy. Their handling, rather than their existence, carries the moral burden. The lesson is to handle the available tools with a steady hand that is aware of its limitations rather than to reject them. The absence of power does not bring peace and harmony. Rather, it is power that serves rather than dictates. Every moment was strained by the need to survive, and the planet was rife with violence in the days preceding the flood. The clamor of today is different but just as exhausting, a never-ending barrage of opinions, wants, and desires tugging in all directions. Living in peace means putting one's feet firmly on still ground and occasionally stepping out of that current. It is to keep in mind that not all conflicts must be joined, not all insults must be addressed, and not all goals must be pursued. Similar to how a craftsman learns his profession, balance is acquired via consistent, careful work rather than big jumps. It involves taking care of one's inner and outward lives, ensuring that kindness is not trampled underfoot by ambition, and that success does not stifle thankfulness. The Nephilim serves as a reminder that imbalance may quickly spread and wipe out wonderful things in a matter of seconds once it establishes itself. A frightening reminder of how quickly the world can be wiped clean when pushed too far is the flood that followed their rule. In a sense, we are now guardians of a more tranquil planet. Our footsteps don't tremble the earth like the Nephilims, and our reach doesn't reach as high as the Watchers did. However, our decisions continue to have an impact on lives we would never see. Just as surely as an act of compassion can initiate healing, a word said in anger can initiate a chain of harm. Living a life of faith and humility means being aware of these ripples and sending them outward in ways that make the world stronger rather than weaker. When amplified over days and years, even the tiniest actions have impact. The legacy of the Nephilim is one of caution, but it also makes room for another, one in which faith endures no matter how high the seas rise, knowledge is led by wisdom, and power is moderated with kindness. This is the kind of legacy that is inscribed subtly into other people's lives, a living record that blossoms in the hearts it touches, rather than being etched into stone or memorialized in monuments. Perhaps the most important lesson that remains for us is that even if the strongest may go silent and power may wane, the option to live in harmony with the environment around us, walk in humility and faith, and fight the slow draw of corruption will always be available. It is a path that may be walked without the strength of a giant. All that is required is the constant bravery to move forward, one step at a time, until the journey itself becomes a silent triumph. According to some, giants are only found in the annals of history, their tales vanishing like mist in the dawn light. However, reports of enormous bones discovered in fields, skeletons longer than a human body should be, and ancient constructions so enormous they appear to be mocking the size of contemporary hands continue to circulate throughout the world. These stories are spoken with a certain lingering curiosity rather than in the tone of established fact, as if the speakers themselves are unsure of whether they are narrating myth, truth, or something that straddles the line between the two. There are rumors of odd find, as coming from the Middle East's deserts to South America's verdant valleys, all of which entice the listener to speculate about what might be concealed beneath the earth. People in isolated rural communities and former mining towns swear they have heard tales from their ancestors about giant skulls discovered when field plowing, only to have them swiftly vanish, carried away by unidentified authorities or lost to time. According to other reports, they had teeth the size of a clenched fist and thigh bones longer than the normal man's height. Those who recount the stories frequently shake their heads, claiming the proportions were too intentional and the shapes too human, despite doubters' claims that they might be the bones of ancient animals. The tone is always the same, a blend of awe and a subtle, unwavering wonder, but the details change. Archaeological discoveries can intensify this emotion. Ancient megalithic sites with stones so enormous that one must stop and consider how they were moved rise out of the ground in portions of Turkey, India, and the Americas. It is easy to picture hands far stronger than our own forming a wall of stone blocks that weigh many tons and are precisely fitted together without the need of mortar. According to conventional history, human ingenuity, ropes, levers, and unrelenting effort are credited. However, a listener who has heard huge stories may suddenly wonder, what if these works were the ruins of their world, silently kept for us to discover years later? The oral traditions of societies that, by all accounts, never interacted with one another have a strange tendency of containing legends about giant-like creatures. There are stories of tall forefathers in the Pacific Islands who were able to easily carry canoes. Travelers in Afghanistan's hills have whispered about seeing footsteps in the dust that are too big for even the tallest men alive. Ancient mounds stand in peaceful fields across North America's Great Plains, and early settlers' chronicles mention the discovery of huge bones inside these mounds, resting as though they were guarding earthly secrets. Though they primarily exist on the periphery of recognized science, there are also contemporary assertions. A mountain hiker occasionally reports seeing a figure of impossibly large size moving through the mist. Strange echoes, footsteps that sound unusually heavy, trees snapping where no visible creature passes, are reported by hunters in the woodlands of distant areas. Such tales are, of course, easily disregarded, and maybe rightly so. However, for some, the prospect is like a silent fire that won't go out. Older myths can occasionally entangle the stories. The Gentilak, large, powerful creatures who are claimed to have wandered the area before the coming of Christianity, are mentioned in the Basque region of Spain. According to Norse mythology, frost giants live on the edge of the planet, out of reach of regular man. There are legends about long-limbed hunters in the Caribbean who could traverse rivers without getting their knees wet. Although none of these tales can be regarded as concrete evidence, they all appear to reverberate with one another, resembling echoes of a long-forgotten memory dispersed around the world. The instances when archaeology and folklore appear to be more closely related are even more intriguing. Photographs from decades ago are supposed to depict excavation sites with unusually large, human-like skeletons. Many have been written off as hoaxes. Some have vanished before they could be investigated, and some have just faded into oblivion without any means of verification. However, the very fact that such photos exist, whether they are authentic or not, sustains the discussion. They instill in people a question that is difficult to ignore. If giants did once roam among us, could there still be any evidence of them, carefully concealed beneath layers of dirt and secrecy? People scour satellite photos of distant landscapes in certain places on the internet and in small groups of aficionados looking for patterns, strange symmetrical formations that could be ancient ruins, lines of stone that could be walls. Occasionally, a structure is discovered that appears too big, too intentional, to have been constructed without either enormous effort or something that is beyond human capacity. Although the conventional wisdom favors human willpower and the inventiveness of early engineering, these discoveries are viewed as mute witnesses to a lost era by those who are captivated by the prospect of giants. It seems more like a question than an assertion that such creatures might still exist, hidden, observing, or possibly residing in remote locations. The ocean conceals its own inaccessible realms, deep caverns wind into darkness that no one has completely mapped, and vast tracts of woodland are yet uncharted. It wouldn't be the first time that something believed to be extinct or legendary was discovered living if there were creatures in the shadows of these unspoiled areas that were the size of something from a different era. The coelacanth, a fish thought to have vanished from the ocean millions of years ago, was discovered in the last century. Eventually, the enormous squid, long the stuff of sailors' nightmares, was captured on camera in its native environment. It appears that nature doesn't always show all of her cards at once. The notion of giants, whether extinct or extinct, evokes strong feelings in people. Maybe it's the wonder at something so immensely bigger than ourselves, the fascination with strength, or maybe it's the way these creatures occupy the space between the known and the unknown, serving as a reminder that we still don't fully grasp the past. It is easy to feel as though there are still stories hidden beneath the surface when we stand at the foot of a mountain that has been shaped in ways that no one can entirely explain, or when we stroll through valleys where enormous stones are strewn about. It's possible that the stories are perpetuated since they can never be verified. They stay enough distant from certainty to allow the mind to roam. It is not difficult to see a shadow moving in the distance, bigger than any man, its steps slow and deliberate, in the stillness of the night, when the wind blows through the trees and the stars are low. Regardless of whether these sightings are only dreams or something more, they raise the same persistent concern that hums subtly in the back of people's minds. If giants actually did once walk the earth, who is to say they are not still walking? There has been a rhythm to the lengthy arc of the stories we have shared, one that starts in wonder, rises to astonishment, and then falls into silent contemplation. We have traced threads that weave together into something huge and delicate, from the beginning of time, when the earth was young and the first breath of creation moved the oceans, to the rise and fall of mighty beings whose footprints may still be hidden beneath our feet. Every moment has been a step on a journey that weaves through darkness and light, happiness and grief, assurance and unsolved questions. It is a road that serves as a reminder of the delicate balance that keeps everything in its proper place, as well as the grandeur of the past. Understanding the true fragility of creation has a strange beauty. Even mountains that endure for thousands of years are sculpted by the gradual persistence of rain and wind. Forests rise and fall, soil changes, and rivers create valleys throughout the course of lifetimes. Vibrant profusion of life blooms, diminishes over time, and then is unexpectedly rejuvenated. Creation is precious because of its fragility, not weak. Every petal in blossom, every bird's song, and every wind gust across a peaceful field all serve as a reminder that nothing is guaranteed here, but that everything is offered. The same reality is expressed in the tales of the ancient peoples, the giants, the Nephilim, and the Watchers. No matter how strong, power is ephemeral. Kingdoms fall apart. Powerful people turn to dust, and only the lessons learned from their life are left. A person's humility is what keeps them steady during storms, while pride might make them feel good. The world might be temporarily shaped by strength, but it is compassion that fosters enduring harmony. Not only are we hearing history when we recite the stories of our predecessors, but we are also hearing a chorus of voices telling us to make wise decisions and to tread carefully. Maybe that's why these old stories still have a profound impact on us, despite all of their mystery and unsolved intricacies. They serve as a reminder that our lives are a part of a much bigger story that is written in the ground beneath our feet, in the sky above us, and in the pages of books. Every moment we spend on earth becomes a thread in the tapestry, interwoven with the lives of those who have come before and those who will follow, even if we may not be able to see the entire picture. Knowing that we are not the only ones who have pondered the immensity of creation or felt insignificant under its wing is consoling. The same constellations that led ancient travelers still burn overhead when we stand beneath them on a clear night. The moon shines as it did for shepherds on peaceful hillsides, as it did for Noah's family after the floodwaters subsided, and as it will for future generations. The earth is full of wonders, life is delicate yet resilient, and hope may blossom even in the most improbable of places. These fundamental facts have not altered despite the world's numerous changes. Hope is one of the most powerful things we may possess, despite the temptation to view it as something delicate and ephemeral. When the future seems uncertain, hope is what keeps the heart steady. It is what enables us to continue moving forward even when the path is lengthy and to find beauty in the midst of sorrow. Through the ark that brought life over the rivers, the green shoot that sprung from the soil after many months of inactivity, and the hands that rebuild when the ruins have barely cooled, hope has always found a path ahead in the stories of the past. Creation is beautiful because it is never fully completed. Every sunrise marks the start of something new, and every shift in the wind serves as a reminder that life is constantly changing and evolving. This reality is present in even the tiniest moments, such as when morning light streams through leaves, when rain purifies the air, or when a child's laughter fills a space. These are the indications that the narrative is still being told and that we are encouraged to participate, not as bystanders, but as guardians. Although taking care of the land and safeguarding its animals are important, being a custodian of creation entails more. It also entails taking good care of, conserving, and honorably transmitting the stories we inherit. Even when we are unable to completely separate fact from myth, it requires paying attention to the wisdom hidden in the edges of ancient legends. It entails realizing that the secrets of the past are windows into awe rather than barriers to our comprehension. We are thus left with a landscape of meaning and memory. We have experienced the days leading up to the flood, seen from the ark's decks as the earth underwent a permanent transformation, and listened to the gentle flap of a dove's wings in the quiet that followed. We have seen the soil grow green and fragrant again, and we have experienced the silent pain of remembering our ancestors, even those who were taller than we can fathom. We have heard voices preserved in old manuscripts, discovered echoes in the remains of other nations, and followed whispers into faraway places. We have witnessed beauty, heard cautions, and experienced the allure of unanswered questions. Ultimately, we carry a sort of reverent awe rather than assurance. The weight of the truths these stories contain can be felt without knowing every detail. All we have to do is keep in mind that, although it can be broken, life, our life, and all life, exists in a delicate equilibrium. That things that are big and powerful today can disappear tomorrow, and that things that are little and unnoticed might become powerful and transform the world. That the seed of a beginning lurks in every ending, patiently awaiting its moment. We are left with the depth of viewpoint rather than the definitive solutions after reading these testimonies. Every step we take is an act of faith in the future, even as the world, in all its frailty, continues to rotate beneath the expanse of the heavens. Knowing that the beauty we currently perceive is a part of something that started long ago and will continue long after is a source of comfort. Comfort in knowing that the thread of optimism remains intact throughout the entire story, regardless of how it turns out. With the peaceful knowledge that each day we live is a piece of a masterpiece that is still being painted, we continue to walk. The canvas is larger than we can see, the colors change constantly, and even though we might never see the completed piece, we are encouraged to contribute our own little brushstrokes. By doing this, we respect the past, take care of the present, and pave the road for the future. We are entrusted with the earth in all its beauty and fragility, and by caring for it, we contribute to the never-ending, hopeful tale that creation has been telling since the first light ever touched the oceans. I hope you will keep this story's peaceful warmth with you as the day goes on, or as sleep slowly approaches if it has brought you comfort and serenity, and if its leisurely unfolding has touched something inside of you. The Sea Words have been more than just a story. They have been a moment of connection, a place where the old and the new may coexist, and where the echoes of the past can gently graze your own mind. And I'm happy you were here to accompany me on this voyage, if it has inspired even a small feeling of awe in you. Simply hitting the like button will help keep this place alive, if you want to hear more stories conveyed in the same kind of kind manner. Even though it's a little thing, it lets me know that the hard hours of putting words together have reached you the way I intended. Additionally, if you subscribe, you'll always be aware when the next peaceful adventure starts, allowing you to rejoin without having to look. It really does matter that you are here. Additionally, I would like to know what time it is where you are and where in the world you are listening from. Maybe you're hearing these words late at night, with the only light in the room being the gentle glow from your screen. Or maybe the day is just beginning and the morning sun is streaming in through your window. Imagine people in different parts of the world, each in their own special location, having this same moment. It's a lovely thing. Tell us about your city and local time in the comments section below. I do read them, and no matter how far apart we are, it always seems like a silent thread tying us all together. I've left you with something that will delve even farther if you've enjoyed studying this section of the Bible. A link to the entire set of all 88 Bible books, including the full Book of Enoch, is included in the description. These ageless works, which contain millennia of wisdom, poetry, and mystery, are riches in and of themselves. They are voices from many generations who have something to say to anyone who is ready to listen. They are more than just words on paper. That collection will feel like a door opening into an even bigger universe. If the moments we've shared here have piqued your interest, sometimes the adventures we take with our hearts and minds, rather than our feet, are the most significant. You have already contributed to something far greater than a single episode or voice by hearing these stories. You have entered a stream that has been running since the beginning of time, carrying with it questions, lessons, and memories that are universal. Your listening has given this story life, regardless of whether you joined for the purpose of learning, finding relaxation, or just being curious. A narrative is just a shadow without somebody to hear it. With you present, it takes on a genuine life. I want to express my gratitude, not in a hasty manner, but with the quiet sincerity that comes from knowing that you have limited time and that you have chosen to spend it here. You gave yourself permission to calm down, breathe, and listen in a world that is frequently noisy and agitated. That is a gift to the storyteller as much as to yourself. From this side of the screen to wherever you are, I want to express my gratitude for being by my side for every scene, every voice, and every quiet moment. I picture the music starting to raise just a little bit as this last chapter draws to a conclusion, its gentle tones bearing the weight of the words without hurrying them away. Maybe you can hear it too, something quiet and lingering, like the sound of waves softly folding against the shore or the wind rustling through tall grass. It's the sound of the story coming to a close, the final ray of light before night completely consumes the sky, or the first hint of light before morning fully dawns. Let me remind you once more before we part ways for the day, if this journey has been worthwhile, please help it reach others by liking the video, following the channel, and leaving a comment with your opinions. It will let me know that this peaceful place we've created together is worthwhile, in addition to assisting others in learning about these tales. Tell us about your favorite part of the trip or a concept it inspired in you. Who knows who might read what you have to say and feel less isolated. I also hope you may discover something that resonates with you if you use the link below to examine the entire 88 books of the Bible and the Book of Enoch. Perhaps it will be a verse that stays with you long after you've read it, or a chapter that seems to have been written especially for you. These are the things that are worth preserving. They get richer the longer you hold on to them, rather than fading. I hope you can feel the boundaries of day or night starting to blur now as the music gently rises in the background. You can rest for the moment, but when you open your eyes again, the world will still be there. Allow each note to take you a little bit farther away from the cacophony if you are falling asleep, until the only thing left is the soothing cadence of your breathing. And may the tranquility of this moment carry you into whatever comes next if you are listening during the day. This isn't truly farewell, it's just the silence that occurs between stories. The journey goes on, with another story ready to be told just up ahead. Until then, keep your soul open to the subtle beauty that lurks in the smallest moments, your heart open to wonder, and your mind open to inquiries. I'll let the music take over for the time being, bringing the final strands of our time together to a halt. I appreciate you being here, I appreciate you listening, and I appreciate you allowing my words to be a part of your path. The story is still there, even if the screen fades,